Hello fellow sapiens, and welcome to Sleepless Homo. This channel is here for slow science and quiet storytelling. No hype, no wild speculation, just humble archaeology and careful history told softly. If you value this kind of long-form content, consider liking and subscribing. It helps others find their way to knowledge. And if you'd like, share in the comments how you use these stories. Do you listen at night before bed, or during the day as you work? However you join us, know that if you drift off mid-chapter, I've placed timestamps in the description so you can pick up right where you left off, because the story is worth hearing all the way through. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. What does it mean to be lost when no one has ever drawn a line on a page? To us today, the idea of losing our way carries an image of a flashing blue dot drifting off the route in a digital map. It feels like an error, like a system failure. But to the people of the deep past, the world itself was mapeless. There were no cartographic lines to follow, no compasses to set a bearing, not even the simple abstraction of north or south written anywhere. And yet, astonishingly, our ancestors moved across entire continents, from open grasslands into icebound valleys, from tangled forests into deserts, from one coast to another. To them, being lost was not about stepping outside a marked path. It was about finding a way through landscapes that no one had ever reduced to symbols, where each direction led into uncertainty. This is where our story begins. The reveal is that despite this absence of maps, humanity did not stumble blindly. We know from archaeological traces that people reached extraordinary distances long before the invention of writing or cartography. By 180,000 years ago, Homo sapiens had already dispersed across Africa, covering thousands of kilometres of savanna and woodland. By 70,000 years ago, some groups had walked out into Eurasia. By 50,000 years ago, humans were standing on the coasts of Australia, having somehow crossed open stretches of sea. Each of these journeys required an ability to choose a path and stick to it, to remember where food and water could be found, and to coordinate movements over distances far beyond what most animals can track. The problem is simple to state but difficult to grasp. Without any maps, how did they keep moving without losing themselves completely? Information begins to unfold here. The truth is, we cannot yet reconstruct the exact thought world of those early travellers. We cannot open their minds and watch how they decided which direction to turn at the bend of a river, or how they recognised a hill they had never seen before. But archaeology gives us fragments of evidence. The spread of stone tools across regions shows us that communities maintained contact across vast spaces. The appearance of similar tool types hundreds of kilometres apart implies that knowledge and material goods were being carried, traded or copied by groups that must have found each other again and again. This means that movement was not random. Routes were remembered, passed down and retravelled. The resolution lies in understanding that to speak of a mapless world is not to imply chaos. It is to highlight the ingenuity of a species that managed to move with purpose, without the guides we now take for granted. People carried the world in their heads and in their stories. The map was not drawn, but embodied. It existed in the rhythm of walking, in the recognition of landforms, in the way the body remembers distances. They knew rivers not as lines on a page, but as flowing presences that could lead you toward survival. They knew the horizon not as a direction, but as a challenge, a promise, or sometimes a threat. And so the haunting question lingers. If they could walk into a world that had never been charted, how different were their minds from ours? Today we outsource direction to machines. In their time, to be human was to live with the permanent risk of being lost, and yet to walk anyway. It is a reminder that our ancestors were not guided by ink or satellites. They were guided by attention, by memory and by courage. Perhaps what they understood better than we do now is that being lost is not always a failure. Sometimes it is the first step toward finding a new world. To add more depth to this opening landscape, it helps to imagine what direction even meant in a time before abstraction. When we talk about north, south, east, and west, we are using a grid imposed only in recent millennia. For most of human history, orientation was relational rather than absolute. People did not think of themselves standing on a coordinate system. They thought of themselves moving toward the mountain, away from the river, along the grazing grounds, toward the rising sun. Place was defined not by an external scale, but by lived experience. What mattered was not where something was in space, but how it related to your body, your group, and the tasks of survival. The world was not an atlas. It was a chain of remembered encounters. Archaeology gives us small glimpses of this. Campsites found in southern Africa show that people returned again and again to the same rock shelters over tens of thousands of years. In eastern Africa, obsidian tools have been traced to quarries many kilometres away, suggesting that individuals or groups walked long distances with clear intent. In Europe, even before Homo sapiens, Neanderthals carried stone raw materials across mountain valleys. These patterns tell us that early humans recognised places as part of a broader landscape. They were not wandering randomly. They knew how to get back to where they had been, and they knew how to describe those places to others so the knowledge would not vanish. When you strip away the maps, what remains is the intimacy of the body with the land. Imagine walking through a valley where every bend, every outcrop, every waterhole becomes an anchor for memory. Returning months later, you may not recall a straight line bearing, but you remember the way the path twisted, the echo of your footsteps against the cliff, the smell of water when you neared a stream. In this way, direction is not external but embodied. Modern research on memory suggests that our minds are especially attuned to recalling spatial sequences and landmarks. It is likely that this sensitivity was even stronger when survival depended on it. We must also remember that humans were not alone. Knowledge of routes was social, not individual. A single person may forget, but a community retains. Elders who had walked a valley decades earlier could recount what lay beyond the ridge. Hunters could describe where game trails cut across a plateau. Families could warn each other of valleys that dried in the hot season. In this way, navigation was not just a skill, but a collective archive. The world before maps was a world in which memory was distributed among people, where getting from one place to another often meant trusting the experience of someone else. One further layer of this problem is scale. To us, crossing continents seems extraordinary, but for hunter-gatherer societies, movement was gradual. Few groups decided to set out to reach a far coast in one sweep. They expanded territories step by step, always moving within the reach of their ecological knowledge, returning and pushing further when conditions allowed. Over centuries, these movements added up to great migrations. But to the individuals living through them, the task was never to walk across the world. It was simply to know enough about the next valley to survive the next season. If there is a quiet lesson in this, it is that the absence of maps did not prevent humans from moving. It prevented them from thinking of the world as fixed lines. The world before maps was fluid, lived, constantly reshaped by memory and weather. To be lost was always possible, but to be lost also meant you were alive, embedded in a landscape that had to be learned again with every step. Perhaps that is what it truly meant to navigate before cartography, not to trace a straight line between 2 points, but to build a relationship with land so intimate that the very earth itself became your only guide. Why does the human brain light up when we think about places we have never even been? It is a strange phenomenon if you stop to consider it. We can imagine walking down a street in a city we have never visited. We can picture the turn of a river bend described by someone else. We can even feel oriented in a place we have only seen in a film or read about in a book. Somehow, our minds take fragments of information and assemble them into coherent mental maps, as if the brain is wired not just to store memories but to anticipate environments it has yet to encounter. This ability is not a late addition to human intelligence, it is one of its oldest layers. The reveal lies in understanding that this skill is anchored deep in evolutionary time. Long before Homo sapiens appeared, navigation was a matter of survival for countless species. Birds that migrate thousands of kilometres, salmon that return to their natal streams, insects that find their way back to a hive after foraging, all rely on internal systems of spatial awareness. For mammals in particular, the brain structure known as the hippocampus is central to this ability. In rodents, the hippocampus contains specialised neurons called place cells that activate when the animal is in a specific location. Over time, these cells fire in patterns that represent a mental map of the environment. In other words, the animal builds a spatial model in its head, a kind of inner GPS without satellites. Humans share this system, but in us it has been elaborated into a capacity that far exceeds simple navigation. Studies using brain imaging have shown that when people recall routes, when they imagine moving through familiar places, and even when they try to picture environments they have only heard described, the hippocampus lights up. This activity is not just about location, it ties into memory, emotion, and imagination. Our ability to place ourselves in a remembered scene, or to invent a new one, emerges from this ancient neural machinery. What we call cognitive maps are not literal sketches inside the brain, but patterns of firing neurons that encode relationships between landmarks, distances, and directions. Information grows clearer when we look at the evolutionary story. As hominins began ranging more widely across shifting African landscapes, the demands on spatial memory would have been enormous. Forest patches, grassland corridors, river crossings, and seasonal food sources all had to be remembered and revisited. Groups that could hold larger, more flexible cognitive maps would have been more successful in finding resources and avoiding hazards. There is evidence that the human hippocampus is proportionally larger than in many other primates, suggesting that selection may have favoured individuals who could remember routes, imagine alternatives, and communicate spatial knowledge. Over hundreds of thousands of years this advantage would have accumulated, giving rise to a brain especially attuned to wayfinding. We must acknowledge, though, that our understanding remains incomplete. While neuroscientists have identified place cells and grid cells that help animals map space, translating these findings directly to human behaviour is complex. Unlike lab animals in a maze, humans use abstract categories, language, and imagination to navigate. The hippocampus seems to serve not only as a spatial map, but also as a simulator of possible futures. When you plan a trip across town, you do not merely recall past routes, you project yourself into a future path, running scenarios in your head. This blending of memory and foresight may be uniquely human, or at least more elaborate in humans than in any other species we have studied. Resolution comes in recognizing that this innate compass is not a metaphor but a biological reality. It is built into our brains, honed over evolutionary time, and it shapes not only how we move but how we think. Some researchers even argue that our ability to tell stories, to imagine sequences of events, and to construct narratives about the past and future all grow from the same neural architecture that once kept our ancestors from getting lost. In this sense, the hippocampus is not just about space, it is about meaning. It allows us to situate ourselves, to connect events across time and place, to feel anchored in a world that is otherwise overwhelming in its scale. And yet the haunting question remains. If our brains evolved to hold vast mental maps of shifting landscapes, what happens when we rely too heavily on external devices to guide us? Do we still carry the same inner compass, or is it being dulled by lack of use? Archaeology reminds us that our ancestors crossed continents without maps, while neuroscience shows us that their brains were equipped with extraordinary navigational machinery. Together, these perspectives suggest that to be human has always meant to live with an invisible map glowing inside the skull, one that still lights up when we imagine places we have never seen. Perhaps the real mystery is not whether we have this compass, but whether we remember how to trust it. If we extend this exploration a little further, it becomes clear that the innate compass is not just about remembering where we have been, but also about how we construct identity through place. Anthropologists studying nomadic societies often note that knowledge of the land is inseparable from knowledge of the self. To know who you are is to know where you come from, and to carry that memory forward requires a brain constantly engaged in mapping. It is not surprising, then, that disruption of the hippocampus in modern patients can cause not only disorientation, but also a fracturing of autobiographical memory. Lose your inner map, and you begin to lose your story. The ancient roots of this connection remind us that for early humans, memory and space were braided together in ways that went beyond practical survival. Another way to think about this is through the lens of exploration. We often imagine prehistoric people as bound to their territories, but fossil and genetic evidence shows repeated expansions into unfamiliar environments. Each of these ventures required individuals to extrapolate beyond what was already known. When a valley ended or a coastline turned, they had to project into the unknown. Neuroscience suggests that the hippocampus is crucial for this. not only encoding what is, but simulating what might be. In experiments, when people are asked to imagine walking through a completely new space, their hippocampus activates much as it does when recalling an actual memory. In other words, our brains treat imagined journeys with nearly the same seriousness as lived ones. This capacity would have been invaluable in evolutionary time, allowing our ancestors to plan routes they had never taken and to envision resources beyond the horizon. We should also note the variation. Not everyone's inner compass is the same. Modern studies show wide differences in navigational ability, with some people easily able to orient in new environments, while others struggle even with familiar ones. Some of this may be cultural, shaped by how often individuals practice wayfinding, but some appears biological, rooted in differences in hippocampal volume and connectivity. It is plausible that such variation also existed in the deep past. In a mobile hunting band, those with stronger spatial abilities may have naturally become guides or scouts. Their talents would not only aid the group, but also influence social roles and perhaps even survival. The diversity of human brains, often seen as a challenge, might have been one of our greatest strengths when faced with vast, uncharted landscapes. So when we ask why the human brain lights up at the thought of places unseen, the answer may be that we are not simply curious travellers, but creatures whose very consciousness is structured around orientation. The hippocampus does not just let us move through space. It helps us imagine a future, situate a past, and connect both to the terrain around us. In that sense, our inner compass is as much about meaning as it is about direction, a quiet inheritance from evolutionary time that still guides us even when we forget to notice it. How did the first humans cross vast savannas with no signs, no paths, no maps? To stand at the edge of an open grassland stretching toward the horizon is to face both promise and peril. Grasslands are deceptive. From a distance they look uniform, endless waves of gold or green. But hidden within them are rivers, gullies, predators, and fire. For early humans 200,000 years ago, leaving the relative safety of a wooded habitat and stepping out into this exposed expanse required more than courage. It demanded an ability to read subtle cues in the environment and to stitch them into a workable system of orientation. The reveal is that our earliest large-scale journeys out of Africa were shaped not by abstract bearings but by ecological logic. When people began to range more widely beyond forested refuges, they learned to follow the features that structured the savanna. Rivers, for instance, are among the most reliable guides. In the East African Rift, freshwater streams connected highland catchments to lowland basins, and these in turn linked to larger watercourses like the Nile. By keeping to rivers, people could be sure of both water and food. The presence of hippo, crocodile and fish was not just a hazard but a resource, and the gallery forests along riverbanks offered shade and edible plants. Archaeological sites along the Nile corridor and other African river systems suggest that humans repeatedly used these waterways as pathways out of familiar zones. Mountains too acted as landmarks. Volcanic peaks in East Africa rise sharply from surrounding plains and can be seen from great distances. For hunter-gatherers moving across open terrain, such silhouettes would anchor the horizon, serving as orienting beacons even without conscious abstraction. To this day, pastoralists and foragers in Africa speak of distant mountains as markers of direction, and it is not hard to imagine that early humans did the same. In some cases, mountains also concentrated rainfall and provided permanent springs, making them not only visual markers but literal lifelines. Herds of animals gave another layer of navigation. Large herbivores migrate seasonally, tracking water and vegetation. To follow them was to be led towards sustenance. By reading the movements of antelope or zebra, early humans could anticipate the broader ecology. Fossil evidence suggests that hominins butchered animals along migration routes for hundreds of thousands of years, long before Homo sapiens. But by the time our species spread across Africa, the knowledge of animal trails must have been deeply ingrained. Predator tracks, dung paths, and the trampled corridors of elephants would all have served as natural roads carved into the grasslands. Vegetation itself spoke volumes. In a savanna, the subtle shift from tall grass to scattered trees signals a change in soil, water, or underlying rock. Certain shrubs cluster around seasonal waterholes, while the presence of palms or sycamore figs indicates groundwater nearby. Archaeobotanical studies show that humans were gathering wild grains and tubers in these environments long before formal agriculture. To locate such resources required not only botanical knowledge, but also spatial memory of where particular plant communities could be found across seasons. This is navigation not by compass, but by ecological literacy, an intimate reading of patterns invisible to the untrained eye. Information becomes clearer when we consider the archaeological record of movement itself. Fossil and genetic data suggest that between 200,000 and 100,000 years ago, Homo sapiens began to expand from southern and eastern Africa into northern regions. These expansions were not single heroic journeys, but waves of movement across ecological corridors. One route likely followed the Nile northward, hugging its banks until the Mediterranean was reached. Another moved east across the Horn of Africa, where coastlines and savannas intersected. The success of these journeys depended less on an innate sense of direction than on an ability to interpret rivers, mountains, herds, and plants as signs. Navigation was inseparable from survival ecology. We should be careful not to romanticize this. The savannah was dangerous. Waterholes that offered life also drew lions. Fire could sweep across the grasslands in a matter of hours. Storms could transform a dry basin into a floodplain. To cross such a landscape without markers required not only memory but constant adaptation. It is likely that many groups failed, dying of thirst or hunger when rains did not fall, or when resources were exhausted. The fact that some succeeded is what left us here to tell the story. Resolution emerges when we realize that the first routes out of Africa were not paved highways, but braided threads of ecological memory. Each step was guided by the land itself, by rivers that whispered of direction, by mountains that stood like sentinels, by herds that traced invisible roads, and by plants that hinted at water beneath the soil. To walk the savannah was to be immersed in a living map, one that shifted with seasons and storms, but could be read by those who paid attention. The haunting question remains, in our modern world of signs and screens, could we still step into such a landscape and find our way? Or have we forgotten how to hear the language of the grasslands that once carried our ancestors across continents? To extend this story of the first crossings, it helps to imagine the rhythms of travel itself. Movement across the savannah was not a straight march, but a cycle of stopping, observing, and adapting. Archaeological traces of hearths, stone flakes, and animal bones show us that groups paused often, establishing temporary camps before continuing onward. Each pause was a chance to take stock of the land, to memorize features, and to share observations with one another. This kind of mobility was not about speed. It was about accumulating knowledge slowly until the landscape became legible. By the time a group reached new territory, they already carried a mental archive of valleys, slopes, and watering places stitched together across weeks or months of travel. One overlooked element in these journeys is sound. The savannah is not silent. Bird calls shift with time of day. Insects drone differently in wet and dry seasons, and distant thunder can signal where rain has fallen. People could have used auditory cues to orient themselves, not in the way we think of a modern compass, but in subtler forms. The constant murmur of a river in the background, or the distinctive echoes of cliffs that told them they were nearing a familiar ridge. In open landscapes, sound carries far, and learning its patterns may have been as important as sight in building a mental map. Another aspect was fire. Natural wildfires sparked by lightning were common in African grasslands. The smell of smoke on the horizon, the colour of the haze in the distance, and the charred remains of previous burns all created markers in time as well as space. Early humans, who already knew how to use fire, might have remembered burned landscapes as signposts, returning months later when regrowth brought grazing animals back. These cycles of destruction and renewal turned fire itself into a kind of clock for navigation, signalling when certain routes would again become rich with resources. We can also consider how these movements reshaped human social life. As groups dispersed across larger territories, encounters with strangers became more likely. Archaeological evidence of exotic stone materials and ornaments suggests long-distance contacts and exchanges. For such interactions to occur, people had to not only find their way across savanna corridors, but also remember where other groups could be found. Navigation here was not just about finding water or game, but about maintaining the social fabric that kept populations viable. To be lost in this sense meant not just wandering off course, but losing touch with allies, trading partners, or potential mates. Geography and society were intertwined. It is important too to think about children. The knowledge of savanna landscapes could not have been learned instantly. Young people would have been taught from early age how to notice subtle cues in vegetation, how to read animal paths, and how to recall distant features. What we see as extraordinary feats of navigation were, for them, ordinary lessons passed along by parents and elders. We do not have written records of these teachings, but the sheer success of human expansion tells us that such knowledge was embedded deeply in culture, reinforced daily by the need to survive. So the picture that emerges is not one of heroic exploration, but of slow, attentive immersion. The savannah was vast, but it was also richly communicative to those who knew how to listen. Humans crossing it were not wandering blindly, but engaging with an environment that, for all its dangers, offered guidance at every step. Perhaps the haunting realization is that the skills honed in those journeys are still latent within us, buried under centuries of reliance on external maps. If stripped of our devices and signs, would we be able to reawaken that ancient literacy, or has the savannah's language faded too far from human memory? The sun sets every day. Did it teach us direction before we even had words for east and west? It is easy to forget that the most consistent guide in human history has always been there, rising and falling without fail. Long before compasses, long before anyone carved lines on bark or stone, the sun offered a rhythm that could be read with the naked eye. Its path gave order to time, its shadows gave clues to orientation, and its seasonal shifts drew invisible arcs across the sky that told people more than they might have realized. When our ancestors walked across unknown landscapes, the sun was their silent companion, pointing the way with a reliability that no river or mountain could ever match. The reveal is that humans everywhere learned to use this cycle in different ways. The simplest was the daily pattern of shadows. When the sun was low, the body itself became a compass. Stand upright, and the shadow falls long in one direction in the morning and in the opposite direction in the evening. Even without abstract categories of north or south, these shifting lengths and orientations gave people a constant sense of change. Hunters who left camp at dawn would notice the shadow stretching ahead, while returning in late afternoon it would fall behind them. This repetitive motion, day after day, reinforced orientation without any need for measurement. Over longer spans, the sun's behaviour also marked the seasons. Anthropologists studying traditional societies have documented how groups recognise the angle of sunrise and sunset on the horizon, noticing that it shifted gradually over the course of the year. In higher latitudes, these arcs changed dramatically, offering cues for seasonal migrations or resource cycles. In equatorial zones, the sun passed almost overhead, but even there, subtle changes in its height could signal the approach of rains or the lengthening of the dry season. For people without calendars, the sky itself became the record. Archaeological sites suggest that some stone alignments, such as those in the Sahara and the Levant, may have been oriented to solstices or equinoxes, hinting that people were tracking solar cycles tens of thousands of years ago. These alignments might not have been observatories in the modern sense, but they reflect an attentiveness to the sun's regularity that could be translated into practical guidance. Information grows even richer when we think about movement itself. Crossing open plains or deserts without landmarks, the sun provided both direction and a sense of time. By keeping track of its position relative to the body, travellers could maintain a steady course. By watching its height, they could estimate how far they had gone and how much daylight remained. Ethnographic accounts of foraging peoples confirm that journeys were often timed by the sun, with decisions made based on how much shadow was left in the day. This is not measurement in hours and minutes, but a lived embodied awareness of daylight as a finite resource. We also see hints of the sun's importance in the architecture of later prehistoric sites. The passage tombs of Neolithic Europe, such as those at Newgrange in Ireland, align with the winter solstice sunrise. Though these are far younger than the first migrations of Homo sapiens, they reveal a continuity of attention. If farmers 5,000 years ago were aligning monuments with the sun, It is reasonable to think that foragers tens of thousands of years earlier were already sensitive to its path, even if they left no permanent structures. The difference lies in permanence, not in perception. There is also the practical matter of heat. In tropical or desert zones, the sun was not only a guide but a force to be managed. Journeys often began in early morning or late afternoon to avoid the midday blaze. This meant that navigation was bound up with survival strategies. Knowing how the sun moved allowed people to plan rests, locate shade, and judge when to seek water. In this sense, orientation was inseparable from bodily endurance. It was not enough to know direction. One had to time movement according to the sun's relentless cycle. Yet even with all these benefits, we should acknowledge the limits. The sun vanishes in cloud or storm. On overcast days, shadows blur, and the guide is gone. For this reason, people never relied solely on solar cues. They combined them with rivers, vegetation, or animal movements. But when the sky was clear, the sun offered something unmatched, a universal anchor visible to anyone who looked up. Its constancy across generations made it perhaps the first tool of navigation shared by all humans, no matter where they lived. Resolution comes when we realize that orientation by the sun required no instruments, no mathematics, no abstractions. It demanded only attention. The rising light at dawn, the slow crawl of shadows across the ground, the arc of setting fire on the horizon, these were enough to keep a group on course. The haunting question is whether we still see what they saw. Today, many of us can pass an entire day without noticing the sun's position, relying instead on clocks and screens to tell us where we are in time. Yet the same cycle continues above us, unchanged from the days when it guided our ancestors across savannas and deserts. Perhaps to look up and notice it again is to reconnect with the oldest compass we ever had, the one written in light and shadow long before anyone dreamed of east or west. Another dimension of the sun as a guide lies in the way it interacts with the landscape itself. Hills, cliffs, and valleys catch light differently at different hours, creating patterns that can be recognized and remembered. For early humans moving repeatedly through the same terrain, these changes in illumination would have been like a clock embedded in the land, a particular ridge glowing gold at dawn, or a shadow creeping across a canyon wall at midday could serve as signals as reliable as any trail marker. Even today, shepherds and desert nomads sometimes describe places not by fixed bearings, but by how they look at certain times of day, as if the sun itself paints landmarks with information. This layering of light and topography added nuance to the simplest form of navigation, transforming ordinary features into temporal signposts. We also need to consider the psychological comfort of the sun. For groups venturing into new environments, its daily reappearance would have been an anchor of certainty in a world filled with uncertainty. Archaeologists cannot measure this directly, but ethnographic accounts suggest that predictable celestial events often hold symbolic or spiritual significance. The sun's cycle may have been reassuring precisely because it was immune to the chaos of storms, predators, or scarcity. To wake each morning and see the same light returning could affirm that orientation was possible, that the world itself was stable enough to be learned and traversed. Navigation, then, was not just technical but emotional. Another subtlety is the horizon itself. In open landscapes, the exact point of sunrise and sunset shifts with the seasons. People who paid attention could remember that the sun rose furthest to the left in one season and furthest to the right in another. This movement along the horizon created a natural calendar, but it also offered a broader frame of orientation. Knowing where the sun tended to rise or set during particular times of year could help people keep track of long-term journeys. Such knowledge would not appear overnight, but through decades of careful observation passed down across generations. Finally, there is the interplay between sun and movement across water. Even without stars or instruments, a clear view of the sun gives direction on open lakes or along coastal routes. By watching its climb and descent, early travellers could maintain a rough bearing over hours of paddling or walking beside shifting shorelines. This does not mean they sailed the seas guided only by the sun, but it suggests that the same principles used on land extended into aquatic environments, further broadening the scope of human navigation. What emerges from all of this is a picture of the sun as more than just light and heat. It was a living guidebook written across sky and land, available to anyone willing to look. In its cycles, humans found direction, time, reassurance, and rhythm. The unsettling question is whether this awareness remains within us, dormant, or whether centuries of mechanical timekeeping and electronic maps have dulled our ability to read the oldest guide of all, the one that has never once failed to rise. What if the stars were not myths, but the oldest road signs? Imagine walking at night across an open plain, the grass shimmering silver in the moonlight, predators stirring unseen at the edges. The sun is gone, the rivers may be hidden in darkness, and the landmarks of day dissolve into shadow. What remains overhead is the great sprawl of the sky, a canvas of points that shift through the hours but always in patterns, always in cycles. Long before writing, long before formal geometry, human beings looked upward and realized that the heavens could be read. This realization transformed the night from a time of fear into a guidebook written in light. The reveal is that stars offered not only beauty but consistency. Unlike animals or rivers, the stars did not change their paths from one year to the next. The constellations rose and set in predictable sequences. For people who watched carefully, they could be relied upon as markers of season and direction. We cannot say with certainty when the first humans began using stars for navigation, but by 50,000 years ago, Homo sapiens had already reached Australia, a journey that almost certainly required night travel and orientation by the heavens. In the Pacific, later Polynesian navigators would refine these techniques into extraordinary mastery, but the roots go far deeper, into a time when looking up meant survival. Information about how this might have worked comes from multiple lines of evidence. First is ethnographic. In many traditional societies, constellations are not abstract shapes but meaningful figures, hunters, animals, or tools. These images serve a dual purpose. They embed cultural stories and they act as mnemonic devices for navigation. Knowing when Orion rises, or when the Southern Cross tilts at a certain angle, provides information about season and direction. Archaeologists cannot recover the spoken stories of Paleolithic people, but the widespread presence of such sky knowledge in later cultures suggests that the habit of linking stars with memory is very ancient. The mechanics are straightforward, though powerful. Stars rise in the east and set in the west like the sun, but with more variety. Each star's path is fixed relative to the others, creating a stable map across the seasons. By learning where certain bright stars appear on the horizon, travellers could orient themselves over long distances. For example, Polaris, the North Star, has been a reliable marker in the northern hemisphere for millennia, barely shifting its position in the night sky. In the southern hemisphere, constellations like the Southern Cross served a similar role, tilting to point towards south. Even without mathematical instruments, these cues allowed travellers to maintain direction far beyond the reach of daytime landmarks. There is also archaeological support for early stargazing. Some of the oldest cave paintings, dating to around 30,000 years ago, may encode constellations. At sites in France, clusters of dots painted alongside animals have been interpreted by some researchers as depictions of the Pleiades or Orion. These interpretations are debated, but even the possibility suggests that people were paying close attention to the night sky. Later megalithic structures, from Stonehenge in Britain to Nabta Playa in the Sahara, show alignments with solstices and star risings, reinforcing the idea that celestial observation was integral to human life. But stars were more than compass points. They were also clocks. The appearance of particular constellations at dusk or dawn signalled the turning of seasons. For foragers, this meant knowledge of when certain plants ripened or when herds migrated. In coastal communities, it meant knowing when to expect seasonal winds or rains. The heavens became a calendar that stretched beyond the immediate horizon, letting humans anticipate cycles long before they unfolded. This capacity to plan ahead is one of the hallmarks of modern cognition, and the stars offered a framework for it. We should not underestimate the difficulty. To use stars as guides requires patient observation over years, even generations. It means noting not just that a constellation rises, but when and where on the horizon, and how that changes as months pass. It demands that groups encode this information in ways that can be remembered and shared. Without writing, the sky itself became the text, its repetition ensuring that anyone who looked up long enough could begin to read. Resolution emerges when we see the sky not as distant decoration, but as a navigational tool that was always above us. The stars made the Earth legible at night, offering a pattern that turned disorientation into orientation. To step into darkness without fear required trust in those points of light. And the haunting question that follows is simple. Have we lost the ability to read this text? Today we glance at the sky and perhaps recognise only a handful of constellations. For our ancestors, the heavens were a living map, constant yet dynamic, vast yet personal. To walk by starlight was to walk with the oldest road signs humanity ever knew, written across the sky in a language of fire that we once spoke fluently and may now only dimly recall. To expand this picture further, consider the act of walking under starlight itself. Unlike the sun, which dominates the sky and sets the pace of the day, the stars arrive in multitudes, subtle and patient. Moving by their guidance requires more than spotting a single bright point. It involves building a relationship with patterns that shift hour by hour. A constellation that stands high overhead at nightfall will have rotated toward the horizon by dawn. For travellers, this meant that the sky had to be read not as a static chart, but as a moving theatre, where every act carried meaning. The sky at midnight was not the same guide as the sky at dusk. Remembering these differences and anticipating the shift across the night gave humans a way to sustain direction over many hours of darkness. One of the most remarkable aspects of this skill is its precision without instruments. Modern experiments with indigenous navigators, especially in oceanic settings, show that experienced travellers can detect extremely small changes in star position. They do this not by measuring angles, but by training memory to notice where stars rise relative to the horizon, a tree, or a hill. This suggests that prehistoric people who lived under dark skies their entire lives could achieve a degree of accuracy that we find difficult to imagine today. Their familiarity with the night was total, and the consistency of star movements rewarded their attention. There is also the matter of overlapping knowledge. By 50,000 years ago, humans lived across Africa, Eurasia, and Australasia, each with different skies. The constellations of one hemisphere are invisible in another, yet the principle of reading them is universal. This adaptability implies that as people migrated, they recalibrated their celestial maps. To do so, they needed flexible minds able to discard old guides and build new ones quickly. It may even be that migration itself strengthened this ability, since survival depended on mastering unfamiliar skies as much as unfamiliar lands. We should also remember the darker side of night. Predators are most active under cover of darkness. To travel then required careful risk management. But if humans chose to move under the stars, it was likely because the benefits outweighed the dangers. Cooler temperatures reduced the stress of long journeys. Darkness concealed groups from rival bands or dangerous animals, and crucially, the stars gave confidence that movement would not descend into chaos. Where the savannah by day might stretch endlessly in sameness, by night the sky offered reference points fixed above the monotony. Taken together, these details remind us that starlight navigation was not a minor skill, but a cornerstone of expansion. To follow the stars was to join the movements of the heavens with the movements of the earth, weaving cosmic cycles into the fabric of human survival. And perhaps the most humbling realization is that this map in the sky is still there, unaltered, waiting to be read. The difference is not in the stars, but in us, in whether we choose to look up and remember what they once meant. Would you risk a crossing if you did not understand the pull of the moon? Imagine standing on a shoreline 50,000 years ago, staring across a stretch of water that separates familiar ground from the unknown. The tide is out, revealing a wide band of sand. Hours later, the same place will be swallowed by waves, the shoreline remade as if the land itself had shifted. For early humans moving along coasts or daring to cross narrow seas, these rhythms were not background scenery, but forces that shaped the very possibility of survival. The moon and its tides became guides, calendars, and warnings all at once. The reveal is that by the time humans began coastal migrations, they had already noticed the moon's power. It waxed and waned in a predictable cycle, brightening the night to silver clarity before fading into darkness. These changes altered when it was safe to move, when fish could be caught, and when crossings were possible. Archaeologists studying early shoreline settlements have found evidence of shell middens, fish traps, and hearths situated with remarkable awareness of tidal zones. While we cannot know the thoughts of the people who built them, the placement suggests an understanding that the moon was tied to the sea and that its phases mattered for planning. Information about navigation by moonlight is equally revealing. On nights of a full moon, landscapes are transformed. Shadows sharpen, water glistens, and travel that would be treacherous in total darkness becomes possible. For groups moving along coastlines, this meant that long journeys could be scheduled around the lunar cycle. Ethnographic parallels show that many foraging peoples timed certain activities, from hunting to shellfish gathering to phases of the moon. It is reasonable to infer that Paleolithic groups too chose their movements based on how much light the sky would give them. In this way, the moon served as both clock and lantern, stretching the safe hours of travel and anchoring memory to recurring patterns in the heavens. Tides added another layer of complexity. Coastal environments are treacherous precisely because they change so quickly. A path that is dry in the morning may be underwater by afternoon. Fish shoals and shellfish beds appear and disappear with the tide. To survive, humans had to learn not only the daily rhythm of ebb and flow, but also the larger cycles of spring and neap tides tied to the new and full moons. Evidence from tidal fish traps in Europe and Asia, some dating back thousands of years, indicates that humans were exploiting these patterns with sophistication. Although many of these structures are younger than the migrations we're describing, they point to a continuity of knowledge that must have roots in earlier times. We should pause here to recognise how remarkable this is. To notice that the distant moon affects the water at one's feet requires a leap of observation and memory across space and time. It means realising that the highest tides come not randomly, but in connection with the phases of the moon. For a species already attentive to patterns in animal movement and plant growth, this would have been one more thread in the web of ecological literacy. The difference is that here the cause lay not in the land but in the sky, an invisible pull linking celestial cycles to earthly rhythms. Resolution arrives when we see the moon not as a passive glow but as a partner in movement. It lit the nights, guided the tides, and structured the timing of journeys. The haunting question is whether we, who still live under its pull, have forgotten what it means. Today most of us are shielded from tides by walls and harbours, from moonlight by artificial lamps. But for our ancestors, every step along the coast was taken in dialogue with that distant sphere, a reminder that the forces shaping survival came not only from the earth beneath their feet, but also from the heavens above. Perhaps what we have lost is not the moon's guidance. It still pulls the sea in and out each day, but the patience to read its message. To deepen this picture of the moon and tides, it helps to step into the practicalities of daily life on ancient coasts. For people who relied on shellfish, crabs and stranded fish, the intertidal zone was both pantry and trap. The knowledge of when rocks would be exposed or submerged could mean the difference between a feast and a wasted effort. Archaeological middens, some tens of thousands of years old, preserve layers of shells that testify to repeated harvesting. These heaps are more than garbage. They are fossilised schedules, records of people returning again and again to the shore when conditions were right. The rhythm of the tides shaped human calendars long before the invention of writing. Moonlight itself carried symbolic weight, though not in the mythical sense we might imagine. From a purely pragmatic view, its cycles gave structure to activities that required cooperation in darkness. A hunt for nocturnal animals, a group move to a new camp, or a careful crossing of tidal flats could all be synchronized with the waxing moon. Paleolithic people may have had no words for lunar month, but they surely understood that the moon's phases repeated with such regularity that events could be planned around them. Even the length of a human gestation, close to 10 lunar months, might have reinforced this awareness, linking the cycles of the sky to the cycles of life. There is also evidence that coastlines served as natural corridors for long-distance migrations. Moving along the edge of land and sea offered consistent resources and relatively open routes compared to the tangled interiors of forests or mountains. But to stay on these corridors required close attention to the timing of tides. In certain regions, tidal flats extend kilometres offshore, allowing easy passage during low water, but cutting off return when the flood rises. Imagine a small band of people trapped on a sandbar because they misjudged the cycle. Those who survived learned to read the signals. The damp lines left on rocks, the smell of seaweed, the cries of birds that fed on exposed shellfish. These details, combined with the moon's phases, built a system of prediction. In effect, the tide itself became a kind of moving landmark, one that could not be fixed in space but only in time. Modern experiments with coastal foragers have shown that people can predict tidal rhythms with remarkable accuracy, simply by observing moonrise and moonset over several days. They know when spring tides will bring extreme highs and lows, and they time their harvesting accordingly. If such precision is possible today without instruments, it is reasonable to assume that prehistoric humans achieved it as well. What they lacked in written charts, they made up for in continuity of memory, with each generation inheriting the observations of the last. This accumulated knowledge turned the moon from a distant light into a trusted companion, one whose behaviour could be anticipated and relied upon. The haunting thought is that the moon has not changed since then. Its pull on the seas remains as constant as it was 50,000 years ago. What has changed is us. We have built seawalls, ports, and artificial calendars that hide its influence from our daily awareness. Yet somewhere deep in our evolutionary memory lies the understanding that to move safely along the shore, to harvest the riches of the sea, and to dare crossings into the unknown, one must first look upward and consider the moon. It is humbling to think that every tide still repeats the lessons our ancestors once read so carefully, even if we have forgotten how to listen. When in doubt, follow the water, but how far could rivers take us? To stand at the bank of a river in the deep past was to face a paradox. On one hand, water promised life, fish, reeds, drinkable pools, and the animals that gathered to quench their thirst. On the other, rivers were unpredictable, sometimes barriers, sometimes pathways, sometimes deadly torrents. Yet when our ancestors began to spread across continents between 100,000 and 10,000 years ago, they turned again and again to rivers as their most dependable guides. For groups navigating landscapes without maps, rivers were the highways of prehistory. The reveal is that the first large expansions of Homo sapiens across Africa, the Near East, and deeper into Eurasia show an unmistakable pattern. Archaeological finds of stone tools, bones, and campsites cluster along river valleys. In eastern Africa, obsidian artifacts travelled many kilometres from their sources, implying that groups were moving along connected waterways that stretched through the Rift Valley. The Nile, flowing northward from the highlands to the Mediterranean, became a corridor that linked climates, ecosystems, and people. Following water meant following life itself, because wherever a river ran, the land around it was richer than the surrounding plains. Information about how rivers shaped these journeys is abundant, though incomplete. Rivers provided practical orientation in two ways. They offered continuous linear routes that could be followed for days or weeks, and they acted as predictable sources of landmarks. The bends of a river, the confluence of two channels, or the distinctive cliffs cut by erosion all left impressions that could be remembered and described. Even today, the brain recalls paths more easily when they follow linear features. For early humans, this would have made rivers far easier to memorize than arbitrary crossings of open plains. In this sense, watercourses structured the mental maps of whole populations. Beyond memory, rivers carried ecological signals. The floodplains of the Nile, Tigris, and Euphrates were fertile long before the dawn of agriculture, drawing wild herds and seasonal migrations of birds. In South Asia, rivers like the Ganges and Indus carved predictable paths through shifting monsoons. In Europe, the Danube and Rhine cut corridors that later became key routes for dispersal during the last ice age. Archaeologists note that many of the earliest settlements in these regions are close to riverbanks, suggesting that humans were not just passing by but anchoring themselves within riparian ecosystems. To follow a river was to travel along a chain of food sources, campsites, and meeting places, each remembered in sequence. But rivers were not always easy highways. Seasonal floods transformed gentle banks into raging torrents. In some regions, rivers dried into trickles during dry seasons, leaving groups stranded. Crossing them could be dangerous with strong currents, hidden channels, and predators lurking beneath the surface. Yet even these challenges reinforced their role as guides. To know a river was to know when it would swell, when it would shrink, where it could be crossed, and where it should be avoided. Such knowledge accumulated only through repeated journeys, passed from elders to the young, embedding rivers into both the practical and cultural memory of a group. There is also evidence that rivers structured human interaction on larger scales. In Africa, obsidian from the Rift Valley appears in sites hundreds of kilometres away, suggesting long-distance exchange along connected water routes. In Europe, the Danube corridor became a meeting ground where different tool traditions overlapped, hinting at gatherings of groups who may have shared ideas, genes and technologies. These interactions were made possible because rivers were not only ecological lifelines, but also social highways. They brought people into contact more reliably than wandering across open landscapes. Resolution comes when we see rivers not just as features of the environment, but as partners in human expansion. They gave direction when none was obvious, food when land was barren, and continuity when memory was fragile. To follow a river was to follow a story written by water across the land, a narrative that carried people from one world into another. The haunting question is whether our species would have spread so far without them. If rivers had not drawn us along their winding paths, would humans have remained clustered in smaller ranges, hesitant to step into the vast unknown? In that sense, every bend of water was more than a channel. It was an invitation to move, to risk, and to discover what lay beyond. To deepen this picture, think about how rivers also carved memory into the landscape itself. A river's path is never static. Over centuries, channels shift, meanders cut off, and new tributaries form. For people without maps, this instability might sound disastrous, yet it likely trained communities to adapt continuously, to never assume the land was fixed. If a bend collapsed into a marsh, or a crossing point disappeared under flood, groups had to invent new ways of recognizing the river's course. In this sense, rivers did not simply provide a route, they taught flexibility, forcing humans to think in terms of patterns rather than absolutes. Knowing how the river usually behaved could be just as valuable as remembering a specific landmark. We can also imagine the sensory side of following water. The glint of light reflecting at dawn, the chorus of frogs or birds clustered along banks, even the scent of wet earth carried on the breeze would have signalled proximity long before the water itself came into view. These cues made rivers perceptible across distances, guiding movement even when the channel was hidden by vegetation or terrain. Archaeologists studying modern river corridors note that settlements and campsites are often located just above flood levels, close enough to access water but high enough to avoid danger. This consistent placement suggests that people read the sensory language of rivers carefully and adjusted their routes accordingly. Another overlooked role of rivers is their connection to stone. Many of the materials used for tools, flint, obsidian, quartzite, are eroded from mountains and carried downstream, concentrating in riverbeds. By following rivers, early humans were not only tracking food and water, but also acquiring the raw materials needed for blades, scrapers, and points. Evidence of tool-making sites along river terraces confirms that waterways doubled as quarries. A group could journey downstream, stop at gravel bars to collect nodules, and then continue with replenished supplies. The river thus became both road and workshop, feeding technological as well as biological needs. We also cannot ignore the role of rivers as boundaries. Just as they invited travel, they also separated groups. Archaeological evidence from different sides of major rivers sometimes reveals distinct tool traditions, hinting that communities on opposite banks developed separately, with less interaction than those connected along the same channel. Crossing water was not always easy, and in some cases rivers mark the edges of cultural territories. This dual nature, as both connector and divider, meant that humans had to treat rivers with respect. They were never just paths, they were thresholds. Finally, rivers shaped the pace of expansion. Unlike open plains where direction could drift, watercourses enforced a kind of discipline. To move with a river was to commit to its winding route, even when it curved away from the shortest path. This constraint may have slowed movement, but it also increased safety. Groups travelling along rivers could move with greater confidence, knowing that the route ahead would never leave them entirely without resources. Expansion into Eurasia, into South Asia, and later into Europe often followed these watery threads, creating arcs of settlement that mirrored the lines of the rivers themselves. In the end, to follow a river was to enter into a relationship with something alive. It offered resources, direction, obstacles, and lessons all at once. Every river was unique, but each carried the same promise, that if you trusted its course, it would take you somewhere new. The haunting thought is that perhaps humans did not choose rivers as highways at all. Perhaps the rivers chose us, drawing us along their paths, shaping where we would go and who we would become. What if you could smell your way home? To us, the idea sounds like something out of folklore, but for people living in the age before charts or compasses, the invisible world of winds and scents was as real as any landmark. Before the invention of written maps, before navigation was drawn in ink, the air itself carried information. Across coastlines and open seas, across marshes and plains, the direction of the wind and the odours it carried became subtle guides for survival. In the absence of visible reference points, these intangible cues provided a map written not in stone or light, but in sensation. The reveal is that winds are among the most predictable forces of the natural world. Seasonal monsoons in the Indian Ocean, trade winds across the tropics, and steady breezes along coastlines all follow rhythms dictated by the Earth's rotation, the sun's heating of land and sea, and the tilt of the planet. While modern meteorology explains these cycles in equations and charts, our ancestors would have learned them through observation. After countless generations of fishing, foraging, and travelling, they knew which winds blew in which seasons and how those winds could push them toward or away from safety. Archaeological evidence of early seafaring in Southeast Asia and Oceania, journeys that must have begun more than 40,000 years ago, implies that people were already attuned to the sky's invisible currents. Boats could not have reached distant islands unless their navigators understood when winds would be favourable and when they would turn treacherous. Information about smells adds another layer to this invisible map. Air is never neutral. It carries salt from the sea, resin from forests, dung from herds, smoke from fires, and the damp, earthy scent of rain before it arrives. For people moving across open water, the smell of land could sometimes be detected long before it appeared on the horizon. Polynesian navigators in more recent centuries described sensing islands through odours carried on the wind, fragrance of flowers, the musk of birds, or the smoke of unseen villages. It is plausible that Paleolithic voyagers did something similar, paying attention to faint signals that drifted across waves or along shorelines. Even on land, smells guided movement. The acrid scent of volcanic gas warned of danger. The sweetness of flowering plants marked seasonal changes, and the smell of fresh water hinted at hidden springs. To follow one's nose was not poetic. It was practical. The invisible map also included atmospheric cues, the feel of humidity on the skin, the sudden chill of a breeze shifting direction, or the dull stillness before a storm all carried meaning. Hunter-gatherer groups and seafarers learned to interpret these changes as signs of approaching weather. In tropical regions, the onset of monsoon winds could transform entire landscapes, flooding rivers and swelling seas. To move safely through such transitions, humans needed to anticipate them. Ethnographic accounts of indigenous navigators reveal an extraordinary sensitivity to the character of the winds, whether they were steady, gusting, or carrying the tang of distant storms. It is unlikely that this ability appeared suddenly in historical times. More probably it was cultivated across tens of thousands of years, rooted in the patient attentiveness of people whose lives depended on what the air whispered. But this system was not without challenges. Winds could shift suddenly, and scents could be misleading. The smell of salt might suggest the sea was near, but coastal winds can carry it far inland. Smoke might promise a village or camp, or it might signal wildfire and danger. To rely on the invisible map required constant testing and cross-checking with other signs. Waves, bird flight, or the shapes of clouds. No single cue was enough. Only the layering of many impressions gave true direction. This required a collective memory, where each generation learned to notice what had proven reliable, and to disregard what had led to failure. Resolution comes when we see that navigation has never been purely visual. It has always been multisensory, a blending of sight, sound, touch, and smell into a whole. Winds and odours may seem faint and intangible compared to rivers or mountains, but for ancient humans they were indispensable. To walk by the scent of blossoms drifting across a plain, or to set sail with the wind at one's back, was to trust in knowledge older than writing. The haunting question is whether we can still perceive these things. Surrounded by engines and concrete, the subtle textures of air are muted for us. Yet the wind still shifts with the seasons, and the scents of land still drift out over water. They remind us that there is a map always present in the air itself, waiting to be read by anyone willing to pause and notice. To extend this further, it is worth imagining the first time a group realised that the wind itself could be predictive. Unlike a mountain or river, air does not stay still, and yet it moves with enough regularity that people learn to sense its rhythms. Along coastlines, breezes often blow inland during the day as the land heats faster than the sea, then reverse direction at night when the surface cools. For early foragers camped near the shore, these daily reversals would have been impossible to ignore. They marked not only the hours of the day, but also offered a dependable signal of orientation. One could wake in darkness and know which way the breeze was carrying the smell of salt, or rest in the heat of afternoon and notice the air pulling inland with the scent of vegetation. These subtle, repeating patterns made the invisible map comprehensible. It is also possible that winds and odours carried social information. The smoke of distant hearths drifting downwind could alert travellers to the presence of another group long before they came into view. For bands moving along resource-rich coasts, this may have been a first warning to approach with caution or a sign that allies were nearby. Unlike rivers or mountains, which only reveal their presence when you are already upon them, the air could act as an early messenger. To recognise such signals required keen attention and an understanding that the wind did not simply blow. It delivered information from unseen places. We should also consider the role of birds in this invisible cartography. Seabirds often ride prevailing winds and return to roost on land at predictable times. The smell of guano carried on breezes, combined with the sight of flocks wheeling in the distance, could indicate proximity to islands. For Paleolithic groups daring to push beyond familiar coasts, such cues might have tipped the balance between survival and disaster. Even inland, the sudden smell of wet feathers or the sound of wings cutting through shifting air could mark a change in direction toward water. The map of winds and smells was never read in isolation. It was intertwined with the living creatures that moved through it. In many ways, this form of navigation reveals something profound about human perception. To move by scent and airflow is to inhabit a world that modern people rarely notice, but it is a world that once defined our ancestors' possibilities. What seems ephemeral to us was dependable to them. The haunting question is not whether this knowledge existed. We see too many hints across ethnography and archaeology to doubt it, but whether it still lingers within us, dulled by disuse. Could we, stripped of our instruments, still read the air as they once did, or has that map faded beyond recall? Did reindeer and mammoths leave us the first road maps? To think of an animal's path as a kind of human guide may feel strange to us now, but for countless generations of hunter-gatherers, following animals was not only a way of finding food, it was also a way of finding direction. Long before people traced routes on parchment or carved them into stone, the migrations of herds and the beaten tracks they left across the land created the first visible lines through otherwise featureless terrain. To move through those landscapes was to read the world as if it had already been marked out by other creatures. The reveal is that nearly all of the great Paleolithic landscapes were shaped by animal movement. In Ice Age Europe, herds of reindeer, aurochs and bison migrated along well-worn seasonal corridors. In Africa and Asia, elephants and antelope did the same, shaping savannas and woodlands with trails that stretched for miles. These paths were not random. They often connected water sources, passed through natural passes, or skirted dangerous terrain. For humans without prior knowledge of a region, stepping onto an animal trail was like stepping onto a natural highway. Even today, archaeologists and ecologists note that many modern roads in Europe and Africa follow ancient game trails, suggesting that once an animal established a workable route, humans were quick to adopt and preserve it. Information about how hunter-gatherers read these trails is preserved partly in ethnographic accounts. For example, sand trackers in southern Africa can distinguish not only the species that made a print, but also its age, its gait, and even the condition of the animal. They are in effect reading a moving diary of the land. While this knowledge is living today, it almost certainly stretches back deep into prehistory. the ability to distinguish the fresh trail of a reindeer from one that was a day old would have been essential to survival. But beyond hunting, such skills also provided reliable paths through difficult landscapes. A human band might follow a herd only for a few days, yet the route could take them across rivers, valleys, and feeding grounds that might otherwise have been difficult to navigate. There is another layer to this. Animals are often more cautious than humans, and their trails avoided certain hazards by necessity. Elephants would rarely force their way up cliffs, reindeer would avoid deep bogs. By following them, humans could piggyback on millennia of animal knowledge. The herd became a teacher not only of where to find food, but of how to cross a land safely. In northern Eurasia, mammoths and reindeer carved out immense migratory routes that humans must have used repeatedly as they expanded into the tundra. To this day, the fossilized bones of mammoths are found in clusters along these corridors, silent witnesses to paths once travelled by both beasts and people. But animals did not only mark long routes, they also left the finer threads of navigation. The paw prints of predators warned of danger, the tracks of small game hinted at food opportunities, and even the trampling of grass in a meadow indicated recent passage. For a human, the ground was a text that could be read, with animals as the authors. To live in such a world was to see every bent reed and overturned stone as information. Archaeologists studying ancient campsites often find concentrations of animal bones that suggest repeated targeting of migratory herds. These sites are frequently located in natural bottlenecks, river crossings or mountain passes, places where animals were forced to travel. To find such spots again and again, humans must have learned the regularity of animal behaviour, turning it into a geographic memory. This raises the question of whether animals gave us the first sense of cyclic time. Herds returned seasonally, their movements tied to rains, grass growth or snowmelt. By following them, humans not only moved across space but also oriented themselves in time. The return of reindeer herds in spring or autumn was as much a calendar as a path. This cyclical awareness helped structure human life long before farming. People knew when to gather at certain valleys because the herds would be there. In a sense, animals were keeping the appointments, and humans were learning to read their schedules. Resolution emerges when we recognise that the trails of animals were not simply chance conveniences, but central to how humans navigated vast prehistoric worlds. The herds showed us the way across continents, their migrations mapping routes we might never have discovered on our own. The haunting question that lingers is whether our first teachers in orientation were not other humans, but the wild creatures we hunted and admired. Perhaps we owe much of our early success as a travelling, expanding species to the feet of reindeer, to the tusks of mammoths, and to the tracks pressed into mud by the animals that knew the land better than we did. In their paths, our own were written. There is another dimension to these animal-made roadmaps that often goes overlooked: their persistence. Once a herd had carved a trail into the land, that path could remain visible for years, even decades, long after the animals themselves had passed. Trampled vegetation, compacted soil, and the subtle grooves left in the earth created traces that humans could reuse season after season. Archaeologists studying Ice Age environments in northern Europe and Siberia have noted that some natural corridors appear over and over in the record of campsites and kill sites, suggesting that people were repeatedly drawn back not only by memory, but by the enduring marks left by migrating herds. In this sense, animal behaviour inscribed the land in ways that lasted well beyond the immediate hunt, offering continuity in a world otherwise in flux. We should also imagine what it meant to follow herds across boundaries of terrain. Reindeer in particular are known to traverse forests, open plains, and even tundra in their seasonal cycles. To move with them was to be introduced to diverse landscapes in a single journey. A human group that tracked reindeer might find itself learning the layout of river valleys, the ridges of uplands, and the approach to coastal estuaries, all in one annual migration. This not only increased their ecological knowledge, but expanded the reach of their own mental maps. It is possible that entire human expansions into new regions were scaffolded on the backs of these animal teachers, their routes acting like invisible bridges between unfamiliar environments. Predators, too, contributed their own form of orientation. Wolves and big cats often shadowed the same prey herds humans pursued, creating patterns of movement that could be read if one was attentive. Fresh tracks of carnivores may have warned a group that prey was near, or conversely that danger lurked ahead. Either way, to understand the pathways of predators was to gain yet another layer of navigational intelligence. Humans did not only learn from the great herbivore highways, but from the predator trails that ran alongside them, weaving a second map of caution into the first map of opportunity. What makes all of this even more striking is how these skills blurred the line between navigation and storytelling. To describe a path to another person might involve recounting not the bends of a river or the tilt of a hill, but the sequence of animal signs encountered. The place where the reindeer passed through the gap in the rocks, the meadow trampled by bison, the clearing where wolf tracks had circled. In this way, animal movement did not simply create roads on the ground, it created narratives that people could remember and transmit. The very act of finding one's way was entangled with the act of interpreting the presence of other creatures. So when we ask whether reindeer and mammoths left us the first road maps, we must recognise that the answer lies not only in the ground they press beneath their hooves, but in the human minds that learn to follow. Their trails stitch together worlds that humans might never have crossed alone. The haunting thought is that our earliest sense of direction was not invented by us at all, but borrowed from the feet of the animals we depended upon. In their patterns, we found our first geography. How do you remember a tree you will never see again? It sounds impossible, yet for our ancestors moving through vast and often featureless Pleistocene environments, memory of singular landmarks was one of the few tools they had. Unlike rivers, which offered continuity, or herds, which created moving paths, landmarks were isolated beacons. A lone tree on a plain, a strangely shaped boulder, a hill rising where everything else was flat. To navigate without maps was to rely on these irregularities, to build journeys around fragments of the landscape that stood out from the ordinary. The reveal is that human memory is especially good at anchoring itself to distinctive objects. Psychologists call this the landmark effect, and it persists even in our modern world. Ask someone for directions in a city, and they rarely speak in distances or angles. They mention the church spire, the red building, the gas station on the corner. This way of thinking is old. In the Pleistocene, when humans roamed across plains and tundra, a solitary oak, a leaning rock pillar, or a glacial erratic deposited by retreating ice would have served the same purpose. These features gave people a hook to orient themselves, something to remember and pass on in stories. Information about such landmarks survives in traces of human settlement. Many Paleolithic campsites are situated near striking natural features, limestone cliffs, caves carved into dramatic hillsides, or distinctive rock outcrops. While these provided shelter or resources, they also functioned as spatial anchors. Returning to a place meant recognising the same stone face or tree line. Archaeologists working in Central Europe have noted that Upper Paleolithic groups repeatedly camped near the same cliffs and hills for thousands of years, suggesting that these features became fixed points in cultural memory. They were not just places, but waypoints in a broader geography of survival. Vegetation, too, provided essential orientation. In a grassland, one cluster of trees might look much like another, but certain species stood out. A grove of tall baobabs, a lone cedar on a ridge, or a line of willows along a seasonal stream could be remembered and recognised. The distinctiveness of these plants made them natural signposts. Some may even have been used as meeting places or gathering spots, chosen precisely because they were unmistakable. Even after a tree fell or burned, the clearing it left might continue to serve as a remembered landmark, its absence as powerful a marker as its presence once was. Stone provided another category of memory. Glacial landscapes scattered with erratics, massive boulders carried far from their origin by ice, created dramatic singularities. These stones, often sitting isolated on plains, would have been impossible to miss. Many cultures much later revered such stones, attributing to them spiritual or mythical qualities. But their practical value was equally important. They were fixed points that never moved, visible from great distances. In a world where the horizon could shift with the seasons, the permanence of stone offered reassurance. You could walk for weeks, but the strange boulder at the edge of the valley would always be there when you returned. Resolution comes when we realise that human navigation was built not only on paths and flows, but on islands of memory, landmarks stitched into the fabric of stories, teaching, and daily life. The haunting question is this: how do you remember a tree you will never see again? Perhaps by turning it into a story, by telling the young that beyond the bent cedar lies the valley with good water, or that the rock shaped like a mammoth's head marks the path to the hunting ground. Long before maps, humans were sketching geographies in words and minds, anchored to the stubborn presence of trees and stones. These were the points that made the invisible world visible, and they remain in some form the way we still navigate today. To push this picture further, we might think about how landmarks were not just physical beacons, but also temporal ones. Certain trees or stones carried meaning because they marked thresholds in a journey, places where you stopped to rest, where a hunt began, or where groups gathered seasonally. Over time, these locations became more than just points on a route. They became episodes in memory, part of the rhythm of a life lived in motion. A boulder was not only a marker of direction, it was the place where your grandmother once skinned a reindeer, where the group camped before the storm, where the trail split and choices had to be made. In this way, landmarks gathered stories like moss, each retelling making them more vivid and more impossible to forget. Another dimension lies in the way distinctive features might have guided not just orientation, but identity. If a band's hunting territory contained a recognisable tree or hill, that feature could come to symbolise belonging. To say, "we are the people who live near the crooked pine," was to define a social geography as much as a physical one. This suggests that landmarks were part of how humans attached meaning to place, grounding themselves in a world that otherwise demanded constant movement. Even as groups dispersed across continents, they carried with them a mental catalogue of such markers, forming the scaffolding of their relationship with the land. We should also consider the sensory qualities of landmarks. A tree is not just seen but smelled, touched, and heard in the creak of its branches. A stone is not just a shape on the horizon but a texture beneath the hand, a resonance when struck. These multisensory experiences helped ingrain them in memory, making them more resistant to forgetting than abstract distances. Cognitive scientists today argue that memory strengthens when linked to multiple senses, and it seems likely that early humans unconsciously used this principle in their wayfinding. To find your way back to a landmark was not just to recall its shape, but to recall the smell of its resin, the feel of its bark, the taste of the berries that grew nearby. There is also the matter of teaching. Landmarks offered focal points around which knowledge could be transmitted. A parent might show a child the distinctive silhouette of a limestone ridge and say, "Beyond that ridge lies the valley where the animals gather." Such instruction anchored abstract directions to tangible features. Unlike the ephemeral traces of animals or winds, landmarks could be pointed out directly and revisited repeatedly, making them ideal tools for intergenerational learning. This reliability may explain why so many myths and oral traditions in later times anchor their stories to striking features of the land. Perhaps the most haunting element is the impermanence of what once felt permanent. Trees die, erode, or burn. Stones can crack or be buried by floods. For people who relied on them, their disappearance must have been jarring, even disorienting. Yet such changes also forced resilience. When a familiar tree was gone, its absence became a landmark in itself, the place where the old tree once stood. Memory adapted, and the geography of the mind adjusted to the shifting face of the world. This fluidity suggests that early humans were not only map readers, but also map makers, constantly redrawing their internal charts to keep pace with the changes of the environment. What emerges from all of this is that landmarks were never simply static objects. They were active participants in the drama of human survival, anchors of memory, symbols of belonging, teachers of direction, and reminders of time's passage. They were the mental scaffolding on which journeys were hung, and without them, the vastness of the Pleistocene might have been overwhelming. To ask how one remembers a tree never seen again is to ask how humans transformed fleeting encounters into durable memory. The answer lies in our capacity to attach meaning, to layer stories, and to see in the stone and wood not just objects but companions on the path. When does moving a single stone change how thousands travel? It seems like too small an action to matter, and yet the Upper Paleolithic was a time when small decisions accumulated into enormous shifts. By then, humans had already learned to read the land, the sky, the tides, and the animals. But there comes a point when observation alone is not enough. Sometimes the world must be adjusted however slightly to make it more legible. That is where the first waypoints appear. Simple modifications of nature. Piles of stones, scorched trees, stacked branches, that turned fleeting knowledge into more permanent guidance. These were not maps in the modern sense, but they were human interventions in the landscape designed to say, this way. The reveal is that even modest traces can alter movement patterns. Archaeologists studying Upper Paleolithic sites in Eurasia have long noted the presence of cairns, small stacks of rocks that appear in places with no obvious natural explanation. While many of these structures belong to later periods, the principle of rearranging stones into visible markers likely began far earlier. The act of placing one rock on top of another creates a signal that can outlast the memory of an individual. It says that someone has been here before, and it invites others to follow. For nomadic groups, such waypoints were invaluable. They offered reassurance that the path ahead was not wholly unknown, that other humans had already judged it safe or worth travelling. Information about markers is not limited to stones. Fire, too, became a tool of navigation. A tree deliberately scorched left a mark visible for decades. In boreal forests, indigenous groups in more recent times used blaze marks, cuts or burns made in bark, to indicate trails or boundaries. While we cannot directly prove that Paleolithic people did the same, it would be surprising if they had not. The combination of fire and wood was already deeply embedded in daily life. To extend its use as a way of making trails visible seemed like a natural step. Charred trees along a valley path could serve as guides not only for the group that made them, but for any that came after. Modified nature could also include arrangements of branches, stones, or bones, set deliberately at crossroads or hunting grounds. Archaeologists have found intriguing patterns of mammoth bones at sites in Eastern Europe, sometimes interpreted as structures or shelters, but perhaps some were left as signals too. Even the placement of discarded tools or piles of shellfish near camps might have acted as accidental markers, reminding returning groups that people had once occupied the spot. What seems like debris to us may have been a waypoint for them. The important point is that these markers were not monumental. They did not require large-scale effort or permanent architecture. Their power lay in their simplicity. A cairn could be built in minutes. A blaze mark could be cut in seconds. But once made, they extended human memory into the landscape itself. No longer did navigation depend entirely on the fragile recollections of individuals. The land now bore traces of intention, traces that could be seen, interpreted, and trusted. This was a quiet revolution, the beginning of humans writing direction onto the world itself. Resolution comes when we recognise that the first waypoints were more than practical aids. They were also the earliest hints of humans reshaping nature not just for food or shelter, but for communication. Each stacked stone or marked tree was a message, silent yet enduring, from one traveller to another. The haunting question is how much of our mobility, how much of our eventual dominance of the globe, depended on these tiny interventions. If no one had thought to move a stone, would we have still found our way so far? Or was it precisely these humble acts of marking the world that allowed us to become the species that could cross continents? If we look more closely, the ingenuity of these first waypoints lies in how they blurred the line between natural and artificial. A cairn or scorched tree did not remake the environment in the way that a village or a field would in later millennia, but it nudged the world into a shape slightly more favourable to human memory. A single stone placed on top of another was still part of the landscape. It weathered, shifted, and decayed like everything else, but for a moment it carried human intention. These were not monuments meant to impress or endure for eternity. They were signals designed to last just long enough for others to notice, interpret, and use. Their impermanence was part of their function. We might also consider the scale of cooperation involved. A cairn visible from far away required more than one set of hands. Even if small, a pile of stones in an open plain might be deliberately built higher than needed so that it could be seen across distance. Such effort suggests shared understanding. Not only did the makers know what they were building, but they assumed others would know how to read it. This shared language of signs may have been one of the earliest steps toward externalizing human communication beyond speech or gesture. The land itself became the medium through which meaning traveled, Another subtlety is how these markers structured memory across seasons. Nomadic groups often returned to the same valleys, caves, or hunting grounds year after year. By leaving markers behind, they made return journeys easier, turning vast landscapes into recognizable sequences of waypoints. This continuity might explain why certain Paleolithic campsites were reoccupied dozens of times across thousands of years. People were not rediscovering these places by accident. They were guided back, perhaps by markers that had outlasted their makers. We should also imagine how these markers looked to strangers. A pile of stones encountered in the wild might inspire trust, but it might also trigger caution. Was this a friendly signal or a warning? Did it mean food lay ahead or danger? The ambiguity itself is fascinating. To interpret a waypoint was to engage in a silent conversation with unseen others, extending the reach of human presence across time and space. This silent dialogue made the landscape itself a shared text, written and rewritten by each passing group. Over time, such practices may have encouraged a new kind of attentiveness. Once you know the land can be altered to speak, you begin to look for traces everywhere. A bent branch, a patch of cleared earth, or a strangely placed bone might all be read as signs. Some were intentional, some accidental, but together they created a heightened awareness of the world as a communicative environment. This shift, from seeing the land as something merely to be crossed to seeing it as something inscribed, was profound. It set the stage for more deliberate interventions in the millennia that followed. So when we picture those first waypoints, we should not see grand constructions or deliberate monuments. We should see quiet, almost invisible gestures that made survival more possible. The moving of a stone, the scarring of bark, the clearing of brush, acts so ordinary that they might have passed unnoticed by the people who performed them. Yet these were the first traces of us writing ourselves into the world. The haunting thought is that perhaps our story as a species of mapmakers did not begin with ink or parchment, but with a single rock set carefully atop another, whispering across the landscape, "This way." What if the first maps weren't for looking at, but for remembering? The idea of a map today conjures an image of a two-dimensional surface covered with lines, symbols and names that correspond directly to the external world. But when we step back into the period between 30,000 and 10,000 years ago, the very notion of a map shifts. The engravings and petroglyphs that survive from this era are not precise guides to physical geography in the way we now imagine. Instead, they are suggestive, symbolic, and sometimes abstract. They may not have been designed to help someone get from one place to another directly, but rather to spark memory, to encode relationships between places, or to preserve knowledge of a landscape in a form that could be revisited and rehearsed. The reveal is that scattered across Europe, Africa, and parts of Asia, we find rock carvings and engraved objects that bear geometric patterns, grids, and arrangements of lines that do not fit easily into the category of pure decoration. At first glance they appear mysterious, but when archaeologists compare them to surrounding geography, patterns emerge. At Montbéliard in the French Alps, for example, petroglyphs carved into stone depict what some interpret as field systems, paths, and mountain passes. In Spain, at sites like a Bounce Cave, engravings on stone slabs appear to represent rivers, valleys, and animal ranges. Whether or not every interpretation holds, what is striking is that these markings show humans experimenting with abstract representation of space long before the formal invention of cartography. Information about these proto-maps suggests that they functioned less like a tool for a single journey and more like a mnemonic device. Imagine a hunter sitting by the fire tracing a pattern into stone, not so that someone could carry it as a literal chart, but so that it could trigger memories of valleys, watercourses, or migration routes. The carving was not the knowledge itself. It was a prompt, a way of storing the skeleton of the landscape in a durable form. In this sense, the first maps were closer to memory aids than to visual instructions. They did not replace oral teaching or embodied experience, but they anchored them. This is consistent with the broader character of Upper Paleolithic art. Cave paintings of animals at Lascaux or Chauvet are not literal zoological records. They are charged images that condense knowledge, meaning and symbolism into visual form. If people were capable of representing the bodies of animals in this way, it is not difficult to imagine that they also experimented with representing the bodies of landscapes, rivers as lines, mountains as shapes, crossings as dots. The symbolic leap was the same, to externalize what was held in the mind and memory. Stone provided a particularly effective medium for this. Unlike wood or bark, which decays, engravings in stone could last generations. Archaeologists who find such markings today cannot be certain what they meant to the people who made them, but the fact of their survival points to durability as an important factor. A carved slab might outlast the person who etched it, allowing others to use it as a trigger long after the original memory holders were gone. This endurance is part of what makes rock art so haunting. It whispers across millennia that here, in this place, humans once tried to capture the shape of their world. Resolution comes when we recognise that these proto-maps were not about accuracy in the modern sense. They were about connection. They linked people to places, to routes, and to each other by creating shared references outside of the body. A pattern of lines scratched into stone was enough to carry a memory across time, to keep a valley or a river present in thought even when it was far away. The haunting question that lingers is whether the impulse to map was born not from a need to measure space, but from a need to remember it. If so, then every satellite image and GPS system we use today is just the latest version of a much older desire, to make the world durable in our minds by making it visible outside of them. There is another dimension to these carvings that deserves attention: their ambiguity. Unlike modern maps, which seek to minimize interpretation, proto-maps thrived on it. A series of lines might mean one thing to the person who carved it, and another to someone else who encountered it later. That flexibility was not a flaw, but a strength. It allowed the same image to carry different associations, depending on who looked at it and what memories they brought with them. In this way, proto-maps acted as open-ended tools of recollection, not rigid prescriptions. They invited conversation and storytelling around the fire, where the marks on stone were explained, elaborated, and connected back to lived experience. We should also reflect on the symbolic weight of inscribing landscapes. To carve the outline of a valley into stone was, in a sense, to claim it. Not in the political way we now think of ownership, but in the cognitive way of making it part of human order. A wild landscape could be overwhelming, indifferent, and chaotic, but when etched into stone, it became graspable, a thing that could be held in the palm of the hand, revisited, and taught. This transformation of environment into symbol may have been as revolutionary as the first spoken stories or the first songs. It was another step toward externalizing thought, turning fleeting memory into something tangible. Some researchers have suggested that proto-maps may also have served ritual purposes. Just as animals painted on cave walls were not merely records of species, but part of symbolic systems, maps might have functioned in ceremonies related to hunting, migration, or teaching. A carved depiction of a river might not only remind people of where to find water, but also evoke the spirit of the place, embedding geography within cosmology. While we cannot prove such uses, the overlap of practical and symbolic is a recurring feature of Paleolithic art, and it is reasonable to think that maps too carried layers of meaning. The durability of these markings raises another haunting thought. For the people who made them, the carvings were prompts for memory. For us, thousands of years later, they are puzzles. We see the scratches, but not the world they were meant to recall. What once anchored orientation now floats free, divorced from its original context. Perhaps this is inevitable. A map without its living community becomes a riddle. Yet even as riddles, these engravings remind us of the deep human impulse to mark place, to give shape to the ungraspable. They are the earliest hints of a cartographic imagination, one that has carried us from scratching lines into rock to charting entire planets. To wonder whether these carvings are maps, in our sense, may miss the point. What matters is that they reveal a species learning to bridge the gap between memory and matter. They show us that long before cities, alphabets, or instruments, humans were already trying to capture the shape of their journeys in forms that could outlast the moment. That attempt to make the fleeting durable still defines the way we navigate today. If you can't write a map, can you sing one? The thought may sound poetic, but for much of human history, poetry was not a luxury, it was survival. Long before writing and long before permanent markers were etched into stone, geography was remembered and transmitted in voice. Rhythm, rhyme, melody and repetition all served as vessels for place. What could not be fixed on paper was carried in the body, recited aloud, repeated across generations until the land itself became inseparable from the stories sung about it. The reveal is that oral navigation traditions are among the most sophisticated tools humans ever developed. They worked not by freezing information into static symbols, but by weaving it into dynamic performance. To move through the landscape was to move through a song or a story, each landmark arriving in sequence as part of a remembered narrative. This was more than simple memorization. By embedding directions into rhythm and chant, people harnessed the brain's natural preference for pattern and cadence. A dry list of valleys or rivers might slip away, but when carried in a melody, it became unforgettable. Information about such practices can be drawn from many cultures. Among Indigenous Australians, songlines or dreaming tracks encode vast networks of paths and landmarks, with each verse corresponding to a stretch of the journey. By singing them, travellers could cross hundreds of kilometres without written guides. In the Pacific, chants taught navigators how to move between islands, naming stars, winds, and sequences of swells along the way. In the Americas and Africa, stories and myths preserved the memory of rivers, mountain passes, and sacred sites, ensuring that even children grew up with landscapes inscribed into their imaginations. These systems were not just maps, they were living libraries, carried in memory and renewed with every retelling. What is remarkable is how effective these oral maps were at transmitting information across centuries. A song can be misremembered or altered, but its basic structure tends to persist. Archaeologists and linguists who study these traditions note that many contain details that align with ancient geological or ecological features: waterholes long dried, volcanoes that last erupted millennia ago, coastlines since reshaped by rising seas. Such accuracy suggests that oral navigation was not merely symbolic, it was practical, a system robust enough to outlast dramatic changes in the land itself. Yet oral maps were never purely functional. They also carried layers of meaning, spiritual, social, and ethical. To sing a route was to affirm connection to ancestors, to reaffirm rights to land, to embed geography and identity. The paths remembered in song were not just directions from A to B, but threads tying humans to the cosmos, the seasons, and the unseen forces of the world. This fusion of navigation with meaning ensured that the songs were valued and preserved. Even when routes changed or landmarks shifted, the act of singing them remained central. Resolution comes when we recognize that oral traditions were not primitive substitutes for written maps, but fully developed technologies of memory. They reveal a human ingenuity that did not depend on tools or texts, but on the capacities of the mind and voice. The haunting question is whether we, who lean on screens to tell us where to turn, can still imagine living in a world where the path home is not drawn in pixels but sung into existence, kept alive by breath, word, and melody. What makes these oral systems even more astonishing is how they manage scale. A single person could not hope to memorize every possible path across a continent. But in many societies, knowledge was distributed across the community. Elders specialized in certain regions, some lineages preserved particular stories, and apprentices were trained to master specific songs. Together, the community itself became a kind of map, its members collectively embodying the geography of their world. When groups travelled, they often carried not just supplies but also specialists in memory, individuals whose role was to ensure that the right verses, the right rhythms and the right cues were recalled at the right time. This was navigation as teamwork, with knowledge spread across human voices like a chorus echoing the land. The oral form also meant that geography could adapt as conditions changed. If a river dried, if a forest burned, if a sand dune swallowed a well, the songs were not discarded. They were revised. A verse could be altered, a chant expanded with a new line, a myth reframed to explain the shifting shape of the land. This flexibility kept the living library alive, and it ensured that oral navigation was never static. Unlike carved maps that risked becoming obsolete, sung maps could adjust to the living environment. The stories remained. but their details grew and shifted along with the land itself. We can also imagine how these oral traditions shaped perception. To grow up with geography embedded in song meant that every feature of the environment was already part of a narrative. A child did not merely see a mountain, they knew the verse that marked it. A river was not just a watercourse, but a line in a story sung by their parents and grandparents. This layering of narrative over landscape blurred the line between memory and reality. It made the world legible in a way that was deeply human, both emotional and practical. Even the performance of oral maps had its own rules. Many traditions were sung only in certain contexts, before journeys, during ceremonies, or when teaching the young. The repetition of these performances reinforced the knowledge while also embedding it in cultural identity. Forgetting a verse was not simply an error. It was a rupture in the thread that bound people to place. In this way, oral navigation traditions policed memory through ritual, ensuring that knowledge of the land was preserved with care and respect. The haunting beauty of all this is that these songs still echo, sometimes literally. In indigenous communities where oral navigation traditions persist, we glimpse an unbroken line back to the deep past. These voices remind us that humans once lived in worlds where to know the land was to sing it, where memory was not outsourced to paper or screens, but carried in breath and rhythm. For us, the question is not whether such knowledge existed. We know it did, but whether we can ever recapture what it felt like to live in a landscape where every path was alive with song, and where the map home was carried not in your hand but on your tongue. When a constellation is a hunter, are we really looking at a myth or a map? The line between story and science has always been porous, and nowhere is this more evident than in the way human beings have used myth to orient themselves in the world. For tens of thousands of years, the night sky has been more than decoration or mystery. It has been a canvas on which cultures projected narratives of animals, heroes, and spirits, narratives that doubled as navigational tools. When you tell a child that the three bright stars overhead are a hunter's belt, you're not only giving them a story, you're also ensuring that they can locate that trio of lights whenever they appear in the sky. Myth, in this sense, was a way of encoding geography into memory without ever drawing a line on a page. The reveal is that many myths are not arbitrary. They align with seasonal cycles, the rising and setting of constellations, and the shifting of the heavens through the year. Orion, for example, has been seen as a hunter in Mediterranean and Eurasian traditions for millennia, his belt stars guiding travellers through winter nights. In other parts of the world, different constellations carry different stories, yet the principle is the same. Narrative provides a hook for memory. A cluster of dots in the sky becomes unforgettable when tied to a tale of pursuit, tragedy, or triumph. This is not just ornament. It is a mnemonic device of astonishing power. Information from anthropology shows that indigenous communities around the globe continue to use such celestial myths as guides. In Polynesia, stories of star ancestors help navigators remember which constellations lead to which islands. In parts of North America, tales of animals in the sky mark the passage of seasons, telling communities when to migrate, plant or harvest. In Africa, myths of the Pleiades cluster are linked to rainfall cycles, their first appearance at dawn signalling the start of planting. What unites all these examples is that myth is not divorced from survival. It is the vessel that carries vital information about timing and direction. The embedding of navigation into story also ensured its survival across generations. A dry recitation of star positions would bore children and fade from memory. A dramatic myth of a hero chasing prey across the heavens, or of a jealous sibling cast into the sky, would be retold, sung, and enacted. Each retelling preserved the astronomical knowledge, ensuring that by the time children became adults, they had internalized both the story and the navigational cues within it. Myth was the encryption system of memory, disguising practical instruction in the garb of drama. There is another subtlety here. Myth allowed communities to layer multiple kinds of knowledge into a single narrative. A constellation could serve simultaneously as a timekeeper, a directional guide, and a moral lesson. By making the same story carry many meanings, cultures ensured its resilience. Even if one layer of knowledge faded, the others would keep it alive. This layered richness may explain why so many ancient myths survive in fragments even today. Resolution comes when we recognise that myths about stars were never just myths. They were maps of the heavens that doubled as calendars and compasses, encoded in narrative form so they could be remembered, retold, and lived. The haunting question is whether we, with our telescopes and satellites, have lost the deeper lesson. To us, Orion is an astronomical object catalogued with precision. To those before us, he was a hunter whose story anchored memory and whose stars guided footsteps. Which way of seeing is richer, and which helps us feel more at home under the night sky? Another way to understand this weaving of myth and map is to imagine the experience of travel itself. On a long migration, a group might walk for weeks beneath the same heavens. Night after night, the constellations would rotate, rise and fall, their shifting positions marking the progress of the journey. To keep spirits up and attention sharp, the movements of those constellations could be told as episodes of an ongoing story. Each evening the tale might advance just as the stars advanced, turning the slow arc of the sky into a narrative arc as well. This coupling of cosmology with direction ensured that people did not simply watch the stars, but actively followed them, both in the heavens and in memory. In some cases, the myths themselves revealed traces of geographic precision. Ethnographers have documented traditions where particular stars are associated not only with characters, but with specific regions of land or sea. The rising of one constellation may indicate the direction of a mountain range, while another corresponds to an island group or a fertile valley. To outsiders, these tales look fanciful, but to insiders they function as coded instructions. The very act of remembering the story keeps the route alive, allowing communities to transmit geographic knowledge without reducing it to sterile instruction. We can also see how myths solved the problem of distance. Human memory struggles with vast, featureless stretches of travel. Myths filled those gaps by giving them narrative shape. A long crossing under open sky could be framed as part of a divine chase, the stars overhead embodying the actors in the drama. This narrative lens transformed otherwise monotonous journeys into meaningful episodes, easier to endure and easier to recall later. Myth did not just encode navigation, it made the act of navigation emotionally sustainable. What is perhaps most striking is that many myths about constellations are remarkably durable. Patterns like Orion's belt or the Pleiades cluster appear in the stories of cultures separated by oceans and millennia. While the details differ, the persistence of these motifs suggests that certain star formations are so visually striking that they almost demand story. Once embedded in narrative, they become sticky in memory, transmitted generation after generation until they seem eternal. Myths anchored in the sky are resistant to erasure because the sky itself repeats them every night. There is a humbling symmetry here. Humans invented stories to make the heavens intelligible, but in turn the heavens gave those stories extraordinary longevity. A myth tied to a star can last as long as the star itself is visible, which in many cases means far longer than the lifespan of any single culture. The stars outlive us, but through myth they also preserve us, carrying fragments of human memory into deep time. So when we ask whether a constellation is merely a hunter or a hero, we're asking the wrong question. It is both. It is a myth to the storyteller and a map to the traveller, a calendar to the farmer, and a compass to the navigator. Its strength lies in this multiplicity. The haunting realization is that modern science has stripped the stars of their narratives, cataloguing them as distant suns with numbers instead of names. Yet perhaps we need both visions, the precise astronomy and the mythic geography, because together they remind us that the sky is not just space, it is story. What kind of courage does it take to sail into nothing but horizon? To stand on the edge of a shore where the sea stretches beyond sight and still step into a canoe, trusting that the ocean holds not only danger but possibility, is one of the most audacious acts humans have ever attempted. Between 40,000 and 3,000 years ago, people did exactly that. They crossed the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, and the Pacific, not with compasses or maps, but with eyes, ears, and memory tuned to the subtlest cues of wind, wave, and bird. It was here, in the act of leaving land entirely behind, that navigation became something deeper than wayfinding. It became a conversation with the sea itself. The reveal is that the earliest true seafaring appears much earlier than many once assumed. The settlement of Australia more than 40,000 years ago required deliberate ocean crossings of at least tens of kilometres. Archaeologists and geneticists agree that humans could not have reached Sahel, the prehistoric continent uniting Australia, New Guinea and Tasmania, without organised voyages. These were not accidental drifts on rafts, as sometimes suggested in outdated theories. They were planned journeys in boats capable of carrying families, tools and fire. Later, by around 5,000 years ago, people in the Mediterranean were making regular voyages between islands, trading obsidian, pottery and ideas. And in the Pacific, the Polynesians would eventually master some of the most extraordinary feats of navigation in human history, voyaging thousands of kilometres across open ocean to settle the most remote islands on Earth. Information about how these early navigators succeeded comes from both archaeology and the survival of traditional techniques. Ocean swells, for example, are among the most consistent signals available to a sailor. Even when land is far beyond the horizon, swells roll across the sea in long, steady patterns, determined by prevailing winds and distant storms. Navigators learned to feel these rhythms against their bodies, to sense when one set of swells intersected with another, and to know which directions they aligned with. A canoe could travel in apparent emptiness, but its occupants carried an invisible compass in their skin and bones, reading the pressure of water and the tilt of the hull. Birds offered another form of guidance. Certain species feed at sea but return to land each night. Observing their flight at dawn or dusk could indicate the presence and direction of islands far beyond sight. In the Pacific, traditional navigators watched frigate birds, noddies, and terns, knowing that their movements traced arcs back to roosts. A flock rising high in the morning could mean that land lay within a range of 100 kilometres. For a sailor facing nothing but horizon, such a sign was as reassuring as a mountain peak. The surface of the sea itself also carried information. Reflected light, changes in colour, or the presence of drifting vegetation hinted at proximity to land. In lagoons and shallow reefs, the sea takes on a turquoise cast that can sometimes be detected from afar. Even the pattern of clouds held clues. Over islands, moisture rises differently, creating distinctive cloud formations that skilled observers could recognise. The ocean was not blank. It was textured with signals, but only for those trained to see them. This training was not casual. Oral traditions across the Pacific speak of years of apprenticeship under master navigators. Techniques were taught in chants, rituals and night voyages, where apprentices learned to memorise the rising and setting points of hundreds of stars. The stars gave orientation, but the sea gave continuity. Together they created a system that required not instruments, but discipline and deep attention. Archaeologists who once doubted the capacity of ancient peoples to cross open seas have been forced to rethink, especially after modern revivals of traditional voyaging. In the 20th century, Polynesian canoes like Hokulea demonstrated that such voyages could be replicated without modern tools, guided entirely by the methods of the past. We should not forget that the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean played their roles as well. By 9,000 years ago, obsidian from Aegean islands was reaching the mainland, proof of regular crossings. In the Arabian Sea, monsoon winds carried early sailors from South Asia to East Africa and back, long before written records described such journeys. Each of these seas posed its own challenges, but in every case the principles were the same. Watch the winds, learn the birds, feel the swells, and never sail without a store of collective memory. Resolution comes when we see seafaring not as reckless, but as deeply learned. To sail into nothing but horizon was an act of courage, yes, but also of accumulated wisdom. Each successful crossing expanded the human map of the world, pushing the edges of habitation farther than ever before. The haunting question is how many voyages failed, how many canoes vanished into the blue, leaving no trace but silence. We will never know the names of those who disappeared, but we live in the world shaped by those who succeeded. Their courage, balanced by extraordinary skill, turned oceans from barriers into bridges. To extend this picture, we should think about the craft itself. A canoe was not just a vessel, but a condensation of many generations of trial, error, and accumulated knowledge. Archaeological remains of early boats are scarce, because wood decays, but indirect evidence points to a remarkable range of technologies. In the Mediterranean, dugouts carved from single tree trunks were used for short island hops, later refined into plank-built boats with seams stitched together by fibre. In Southeast Asia and Oceania, lashed lug canoes bound with plant cordage allowed for flexible joints that absorbed the stresses of ocean swells. The outrigger, a lateral float tied to the main hull, stabilised these canoes against capsizing, making long-distance voyages more secure. These were not primitive rafts adrift at the mercy of currents. They were carefully engineered machines, born from centuries of observing wood, water, and wind. But just as important as the craft was the social system that supported them. A voyage across open water required planning, provisioning, and cooperation. Fish, coconuts, and dried tubers had to be stored. Gourds carried fresh water. Fire was sometimes brought aboard to cook en route. This level of preparation implies communal effort and decision-making. Who would go? Who would stay behind? Who would carry the responsibility of guiding the canoe across unseen waters? The very existence of these voyages shows that communities were capable of organising collective ventures that risked lives for the sake of possibility, settlement, trade, or exploration. We must also reckon with the psychological challenge. To leave the sight of land is to step into an expanse that seems infinite. For people accustomed to the contours of forests, plains, or mountains, the ocean presented a sensory void, horizon in all directions. Yet to trained navigators, this void was not empty but alive with signals. The steady rhythm of swells became as familiar as a road. The patterns of bird flight, the smell of a distant land, the faint shift of clouds, these filled the horizon with information. What looks to us like terrifying emptiness was, to them, a legible and inhabited world. Evidence of early voyages reveals their transformative effect. The first colonisation of Australia opened a continent that would develop unique ecosystems and human cultures isolated for tens of millennia. The settlement of the Mediterranean islands linked communities and exchange networks that carried obsidian and shells across hundreds of kilometres. And in the Pacific, the great voyages of Lapita peoples created a cultural web stretching from New Guinea to Tonga by 3,000 years ago. These achievements reshaped human geography, turning oceans into highways and scattering our species into some of the most remote corners of the globe. The haunting thought is how thin the line was between success and failure. A misjudged current, a storm arriving too soon, a shortage of food or water, all could spell disaster. Many voyages likely ended without record, lost to the silence of the sea. Yet enough succeeded that humans reached every inhabitable island in the Pacific, and that success reshaped history. It reminds us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to step into uncertainty, armed with knowledge, skill, and trust in others. The canoe and the ocean were not opposites, but partners, one made by human hands, the other given by the planet, together carrying us into new worlds. When the world is a white blur, what do you follow? For much of the time between 50,000 and 15,000 years ago, vast stretches of Europe were locked in ice and snow. Forests thinned into tundra, glaciers crawled across valleys, and the horizon often disappeared into sheets of whiteness. To survive in such an environment was not only a test of endurance, but also of navigation. In temperate landscapes, rivers, trees, and hills gave orientation. On the steppe, animal paths carved lines through the grass. But on ice and snow, everything threatened to look the same. The Ice Age traveller had to learn to read subtler signs, ones that shifted with weather and season, and to rely on knowledge that was less visible but no less real. The reveal is that even in these frozen landscapes the Earth was not featureless. Glaciers, for all their apparent uniformity, left moraines, ridges of rock and debris that could be followed like walls. Meltwater streams carved gullies through ice sheets, their paths as predictable as rivers elsewhere. Wind scoured certain ridges and piled snow into others, creating shapes and contours that could be memorized. Survival meant noticing these distinctions, embedding them in memory, and teaching them to others. Archaeological traces of repeated settlement in caves and rock shelters suggest that groups knew exactly how to find their way back to the same places year after year, even as ice advanced and retreated around them. Information about orientation in snowbound landscapes also comes from ethnographic parallels with Arctic hunter-gatherers. The Inuit, Sami and Chukchi developed extraordinary skills in reading snow, ice and wind. A shift in snow texture reveals where prevailing winds come from. The underside of clouds reflects the whiteness of ice, or the darker hues of open water, allowing distant features to be located without direct sight. Similar skills must have been part of the repertoire of Paleolithic Europeans. The ability to read light, shadow, and wind on snow would have been the difference between a group finding shelter and wandering fatally astray. Animals, too, remained guides even in icy worlds. Reindeer herds still followed seasonal migrations, leaving trails etched into snow and tundra. Mammoths, bison, and horses cut paths through drifts, their movement carving temporary highways across otherwise impassable plains. Hunters who tracked them gained not only food, but also direction. Following the animals meant following the routes that led to water, grazing, and shelter. Ice Age humans were never alone in their orientation. They shared it with the creatures whose survival depended on the same skills. The ice itself offered lessons. Travellers learned to avoid smooth, gleaming surfaces where hidden cracks or thin ice might lie. They recognised the bluish tint of glacial ice as distinct from new snow, knowing which surfaces could be trusted. Even the sound of ice mattered. A deep groan signalled shifting masses, while a brittle crack warned of imminent danger. Such acoustic cues formed part of the sensory map of survival. The landscape was not mute, but speaking constantly, if one knew how to listen. Resolution comes when we realise that what looks like a blank expanse of white was, to Ice Age humans, a world filled with cues. The difference lay in perception. Where we might see monotony, they saw texture, pattern, and direction. The haunting question is whether such perception still lingers within us, buried beneath millennia of easier paths and warmer climates. Could we, if thrust into that frozen world, learn again to see in snow what they once saw? Or has the skill faded forever, leaving only the archaeological traces of people who mastered the art of moving through ice when the world itself seemed determined to erase every landmark? Another dimension of navigating glacial Europe lies in the rhythm of light itself. During long winters, daylight was scarce, sometimes reduced to only a few hours of dim sun low on the horizon. In such conditions, shadows stretched long and distorted, but their consistency could still provide orientation. Groups learned how to judge direction from the faint arc of the sun's passage, even when it never rose far above the land. In summer, the opposite problem arose. Long days with little darkness, where orientation depended less on night skies and more on the subtle angles of illumination. To survive in this oscillating cycle meant carrying an internal calendar of light, knowing how the world shifted month to month and adjusting routes accordingly. Glacial landscapes also had a peculiar habit of hiding danger behind beauty. Snowdrifts could conceal crevasses, while flat ice might disguise thin layers that would give way under weight. Experienced travellers likely developed a lexicon of tests, prodding with spears, throwing stones, listening to echoes, that revealed what the eye could not. These habits created a repertoire of embodied knowledge, a way of moving through ice that was half physical instinct, half accumulated teaching. We cannot reconstruct all of their methods, but the repeated success of human groups across Europe during this era tells us that such methods worked. They kept families alive long enough for stories and skills to be passed forward. Another subtle form of orientation may have come from wind-driven snow itself. When storms swept across the plains, they sculpted surfaces into ridges known today as sastrugi, elongated patterns aligned with prevailing winds. To an untrained observer, these ripples look random, but to a practiced eye, they point to the direction of winds and can be used like an arrow toward orientation. Hunters in Siberia still read them in this way, and there is little reason to think Paleolithic people in Europe did not. To walk across an endless white plain, seeing nothing but undulating snow, and yet to know exactly which way the wind carved it, that was navigation at its most elemental. Perhaps the most humbling thought is that ice was both enemy and ally. It could erase paths overnight, but it also preserved them in new forms. Frozen rivers created seasonal highways, allowing bands to move swiftly across regions that would be swampy in summer. Glacial margins provided reliable water and shelter, even as they shifted slowly over centuries. The very substance that threatened to smother the land also gave it structure. To follow ice was to live with contradiction, always wary yet always dependent. What emerges is a picture of humans who did not conquer the ice but learned to walk with it, to see its surfaces as a constantly changing map. The haunting realization is that this map was temporary, vanishing as quickly as snow melted or glaciers retreated. Yet for tens of millennia, people read it well enough to endure. Their survival reminds us that even the most unforgiving landscapes are legible, if only one listens closely enough. How do you cross a land that looks the same in every direction? To step into a desert is to enter a geography that strips away the usual anchors of orientation. Hills and rivers vanish, forests are absent, and horizons shimmer with heat. The Sahara, during its long cycles of expansion and retreat in the Pleistocene and Holocene, was both a barrier and a bridge, stretching thousands of kilometres across North Africa. To move through it required skills that were not obvious, for deserts are deceptive landscapes. Dunes shift, mirages mislead, and the sun is both compass and torment. Yet humans did cross, and the fact that they did is proof that deserts were never truly empty. They were environments with their own systems of cues, ones that rewarded patience, attention, and inherited knowledge. The reveal is that the Sahara was not always a desert. During humid phases of the Holocene, beginning roughly 10,000 years ago, the region was dotted with lakes, savannas, and grasslands. Rock art in places like Tassili Naja depicts cattle, giraffes, and lush vegetation where there is now only sand. But as climates shifted, aridity returned, leaving behind corridors of dunes punctuated by oases and wells. For groups moving through these landscapes, survival navigation meant learning how to find water, how to avoid disorientation, and how to trust the few reliable signals that the desert offered. Information about these methods comes from ethnography and archaeology. Wells were lifelines, and their locations were memorized with obsessive care. Knowledge of where to find them was passed orally across generations, often encoded in place names, stories, or rituals. The distance between wells might be measured in days of walking, each stage requiring careful pacing of resources. Caravans in later millennia followed similar principles, demonstrating continuity between prehistoric and historic practices. Without these waypoints of water, desert travel would have been impossible. The dunes themselves provided subtle orientation. While they appear chaotic, dune fields often align with prevailing winds, forming long ridges oriented consistently across vast distances. Travellers who understood this could use dune direction as a compass, knowing that the ridges pointed reliably with the dominant winds of the season. Sand ripples underfoot, shaped by breezes, also betrayed wind patterns. These natural alignments, invisible to the untrained, gave the desert its hidden order. Mirages added complexity. Shimmering pools on the horizon are illusions caused by heated air-bending light, yet even these could carry information. Experienced desert dwellers knew how to distinguish false reflections from true water sources, reading subtleties of colour, movement, and the behaviour of birds. In some cases, mirages may even have helped guide people, for the distortions of air can reveal distant mountains or features that would otherwise be invisible to the eye. To see clearly in the desert meant learning how to interpret distortion, not just reality. At night, stars became anchors. The desert sky is famously clear, and constellations offered fixed guides when the ground provided none. Unlike forests or mountains, deserts present few obstructions, making the arc of the heavens even more prominent. To walk by starlight across sand was not only possible, but often preferable, as the cool night spared travellers the deadly heat of the day. Desert navigation thus combined terrestrial cues by day with celestial maps by night, blending earth and sky into a single system. Resolution comes when we recognise that deserts, for all their danger, were never impassable voids. They were structured by wells, winds, dunes and stars, each offering fragments of orientation that together created survivable routes. The haunting question is how much knowledge was lost with those who first learned it. How many wells are now buried? How many stories forgotten? How many paths erased by shifting sands? The Sahara today still holds these traces, hidden beneath dunes, waiting for archaeology to uncover them. But the people who once walked those deserts needed no archaeology. They carried the map within themselves, reading the land with a precision that allowed them to survive where the untrained eye sees only sameness. Another element of desert navigation lies in the way plants and animals themselves became signs. Even in the harshest stretches of the Sahara, vegetation is not evenly distributed. The presence of certain shrubs or the sudden appearance of palms often indicated groundwater beneath the surface. Travellers would have learned to recognise these subtle signals, associating a particular shade of green with hidden moisture. Likewise, the flight of birds could betray the location of oases. Doves, for instance, rarely range far from water, and their direction of flight at dawn or dusk could act as a compass more reliable than any mirage. In this way, life itself was a map, each creature unknowingly pointing the way to survival. The desert also forced people to think in terms of rhythm and timing rather than simple distance. Journeys were often measured not in kilometres, but in days between water sources, or in the number of nights under certain constellations before the next rest point. This mode of reckoning was flexible, accommodating the way dunes shifted or storms altered the surface of the land. To survive, groups had to internalise an almost musical sense of travel, a cadence set by footsteps, heat, and thirst. A journey was not simply about reaching the other side, but about surviving each interval, each stage along the way. Archaeological finds suggest that routes across the desert were not straight but braided. People followed paths that wove between higher ground and depressions, avoiding salt flats, steering toward rocky outcrops where shade or water might be found. Over time, these braided tracks formed corridors of movement, invisible to us now, but embedded in memory for the people who once walked them. Rock art depicting cattle and herders carved into cliffs in southern Algeria hints that such paths were well established in the Holocene Green Sahara, when grasslands stretched deep into what is now arid desert. Even as climates shifted back toward dryness, those remembered corridors would have remained useful, reactivated when conditions allowed. We should also consider the role of silence. In the desert, where sound travels far and few features break the horizon, orientation can come from the faintest cues. The echo of a voice against stone, the distant howl of wind in a canyon, even the muted hum of insects near an oasis. Travellers who attuned themselves to these subtleties could detect features long before they were visible. It was a kind of echolocation through patience, listening for the land to speak in its sparse, austere voice. What all of this reveals is that deserts were not the blank, lifeless voids we often imagine. They were landscapes rich in information, but only to those who learned their language. For the untrained, the Sahara was a labyrinth of sand and glare. For those who carried the memory of wells, the signs of life, the rhythm of footsteps, and the compass of stars, it was a place that could be crossed, inhabited, and even cherished. The haunting thought is that what we now see as wasteland was once a land of pathways, as carefully charted in memory as any modern road. When every tree looks the same, how do you not get lost? To step into a tropical jungle is to enter a maze where vision shrinks to a few meters, where vines and leaves form walls, and where the canopy swallows the sky. For prehistoric travellers, the forest presented a problem opposite to the desert or tundra. Instead of emptiness, there was excess, an overwhelming density of forms, colours and sounds that blurred into sameness. Moving through such a place without a compass, map or clear horizon seems impossible, yet humans managed it for tens of thousands of years. Their survival in jungles across Africa, South Asia, and the Americas depended on learning to see and hear patterns invisible to the untrained eye. The reveal is that the jungle is not as uniform as it seems. Paths emerge through use, animal trails pressed into the undergrowth, streams carving lines through the green, and ridges rising above floodplains. Early humans learned to follow these, not by sight alone but by sound and rhythm. In the forest, sound carries in distinctive ways. The noise of running water can be heard long before a river is seen. Bird calls shift with habitat, letting the listener know if they are in swamp, canopy, or open glade. Even the buzz of insects tells something about moisture, vegetation, and time of day. For a people who paid close attention, the forest was as legible as a desert sky. Information about forest navigation also comes from contemporary indigenous traditions. In Amazonia, groups use the calls of howler monkeys and macaws as directional cues, for their territories mark specific ecological zones. In African rainforests, hunter-gatherers learn to interpret the density of undergrowth, knowing that lighter vegetation indicates paths trodden by elephants or other animals. In Southeast Asia, river systems serve as highways, with orientation achieved not by cutting through jungle at random, but by moving along watercourses and ridges. Archaeological evidence of repeated settlement in forested environments suggests that such strategies were in use for thousands of years, long before agriculture cleared wide spaces. The density of vegetation forced humans to rely heavily on memory. A single distinctive tree, a bend in a stream, or a patch of unusual rock became landmarks far more important than mountains or valleys in open terrain. Travellers memorised these points in sequence, creating mental chains of orientation that guided them back home. Oral knowledge reinforced the process, with stories, songs, or rituals embedding the order of landmarks into cultural memory. Losing track of such cues meant more than inconvenience. In a jungle, disorientation could quickly become fatal, as visibility vanished and resources were unevenly distributed. Resolution comes when we realise that the forest, like all extreme environments, demanded humility. It required listening more than looking, remembering more than recording. The haunting question is whether we, with our dependence on visual maps and clear horizons, could survive in such a labyrinth. Could we relearn to hear the forest as our ancestors did, to turn its overwhelming noise into a navigational song? Or is that skill one of the many we left behind when we traded the jungle for the open fields of agriculture? Another striking feature of jungle navigation lies in the way movement itself was adjusted to the environment. In open plains, speed mattered, but in dense forest, progress was measured in patience. Moving too quickly risked missing subtle cues, stepping into hidden swamps, or passing by edible plants and animal traces. Groups learned to move at a rhythm that allowed for constant observation, pausing to listen, tasting the air, scanning for breaks in the canopy where light revealed direction. This slower pace was not inefficiency, it was adaptation, a way to ensure that each step extended knowledge rather than drained it. Seasonal change also shaped how people found their way. In tropical zones, wet and dry seasons transformed the forest, flooding rivers, altering vegetation, and changing animal behaviour. A trail that was passable in the dry season might vanish underwater during the rains, replaced by canoe routes through flooded forest. Successful navigation depended on remembering these seasonal shifts and adjusting strategies accordingly. Oral knowledge passed through generations likely contained references to these transformations, teaching when to follow rivers and when to avoid them, when to rely on animal paths and when they would be impassable. This cyclical awareness turned time itself into a navigational tool. Smell, too, played a role. The forest carries scent strongly, and hunters could detect the musk of animals or the fragrance of flowering trees long before seeing them. These odours, faint yet distinct, provided orientation not in the sense of direction but of presence. Here is water buffalo, here is fruiting fig, here is honey hidden in a hollow trunk. While modern accounts often overlook olfactory knowledge, it is plausible that prehistoric forest dwellers relied heavily on this sense, just as they did on sound. Together, the layered cues of hearing and smell compensated for the limited reach of sight. Another fascinating dimension is the use of canopy and light. In thick forest, the canopy filters the sun into mottled patterns, but the direction of light still shifts predictably with time of day. Skilled travellers could read these patterns, discerning east from west even without a clear horizon. At dawn, light angled through the trees differently than at noon or dusk, and the memory of these subtleties became part of the invisible compass carried in the mind. Archaeologists and anthropologists studying traditional forest societies have noted similar practices, suggesting deep continuity across millennia. Perhaps most importantly, forests taught humans to navigate socially. Unlike deserts or plains, where a single skilled tracker might lead, in dense forests knowledge was pooled. One person might recall a stand of fruit trees, another the sound of a stream, another the shape of a termite mound used as a landmark. Together, these fragments created a communal map, updated constantly as the group moved. This cooperative model of navigation ensured survival in environments where one person's knowledge was rarely enough. The haunting truth is that while jungles appear chaotic, they hold as much structure as the stars or dunes. It is only hidden from those who no longer listen for insect pitch, smell for blossoms, or remember how light bends in leaves. For our ancestors, the green labyrinth was not confusion, but a library of cues, each tree and bird call a page in a book of survival. The forest was not just an obstacle, it was a teacher demanding constant attention, rewarding memory and punishing arrogance. It was, in its own way, a map written in sound, scent, and shadow. Another striking feature of jungle navigation lies in the way movement itself was adjusted to the environment. In open plains, speed mattered, but in dense forest, progress was measured in patience. Moving too quickly risked missing subtle cues, stepping into hidden swamps, or passing by edible plants and animal traces. Groups learned to move at a rhythm that allowed for constant observation, pausing to listen, tasting the air, scanning for breaks in the canopy where light revealed direction. This slower pace was not inefficiency, it was adaptation, a way to ensure that each step extended knowledge rather than drained it. Seasonal change also shaped how people found their way. In tropical zones, wet and dry seasons transformed the forest, flooding rivers, altering vegetation, and changing animal behaviour. A trail that was passable in the dry season might vanish underwater during the rains, replaced by canoe routes through flooded forest. Successful navigation depended on remembering these seasonal shifts and adjusting strategies accordingly. Oral knowledge passed through generations likely contained references to these transformations, teaching when to follow rivers and when to avoid them, when to rely on animal paths and when they would be impassable. This cyclical awareness turned time itself into a navigational tool. Smell, too, played a role. The forest carries scent strongly, and hunters could detect the musk of animals or the fragrance of flowering trees long before seeing them. These odours, faint yet distinct, provided orientation not in the sense of direction but of presence. Here is water buffalo, here is fruiting fig, here is honey hidden in a hollow trunk. While modern accounts often overlook olfactory knowledge, it is plausible that prehistoric forest dwellers relied heavily on this sense, just as they did on sound. Together, the layered cues of hearing and smell compensated for the limited reach of sight. Another fascinating dimension is the use of canopy and light. In thick forest, the canopy filters the sun into mottled patterns, but the direction of light still shifts predictably with time of day. Skilled travellers could read these patterns, discerning east from west even without a clear horizon. At dawn, light angled through the trees differently than at noon or dusk, and the memory of these subtleties became part of the invisible compass carried in the mind. Archaeologists and anthropologists studying traditional forest societies have noted similar practices, suggesting deep continuity across millennia. Perhaps most importantly, forests taught humans to navigate socially. Unlike deserts or plains, where a single skilled tracker might lead, in dense forests knowledge was pooled. One person might recall a stand of fruit trees, another the sound of a stream, another the shape of a termite mound used as a landmark. Together, these fragments created a communal map, updated constantly as the group moved. This cooperative model of navigation ensured survival in environments where one person's knowledge was rarely enough. The haunting truth is that while jungles appear chaotic, they hold as much structure as the stars or dunes. It is only hidden from those who no longer listen for insect pitch, smell for blossoms, or remember how light bends in leaves. For our ancestors, the green labyrinth was not confusion, but a library of cues, each tree and bird call a page in a book of survival. The forest was not just an obstacle, it was a teacher demanding constant attention, rewarding memory and punishing arrogance. It was, in its own way, a map written in sound, scent, and shadow. What made these early routes so powerful was that they were stitched into webs of meaning beyond the exchange of objects. A piece of flint or obsidian was not just a cutting edge, it was proof of connection to a far-off place, and to the people who lived there. Carrying it meant carrying a story, of the volcano where it came from, of the long path that led there, of the faces met along the way. In this sense, navigation became inseparable from identity. To know the path to a distant quarry or coastline was to hold knowledge that enhanced one's status, weaving geography into social standing. These journeys also demanded new ways of thinking about distance. In earlier epochs, movement might have been reactive, tied to immediate needs. But once trade emerged, humans began to conceptualize routes as planned chains of movement. Instead of simply knowing the way to water or prey, they needed to know how to return next year, how to reach a meeting place across shifting conditions. This kind of planning required not only memory of landmarks, but abstraction, the ability to imagine the journey as a repeatable pattern, independent of the day-to-day contingencies of hunting. It was, in a sense, the birth of scheduled travel, though without calendars written in ink. The archaeological record hints at the significance of these repeated crossings. In Europe, Upper Paleolithic sites far from the Mediterranean contain seashell beads, sometimes found in burials, suggesting that such objects were prized precisely because they came from afar. In the Near East, obsidian artifacts have been traced chemically to single volcanic sources hundreds of kilometers away. Each shard is a fossilized trace of human footsteps across the land, evidence that someone remembered the path well enough to carry stone from its birthplace to a distant community. The goods may have changed hands many times, but the routes linking them relied on continuity of knowledge. We can also imagine how these journeys reinforced cultural bonds. Meeting at fixed intervals across landscapes allowed groups to share not only materials but marriages, songs and rituals. Trade routes thus became cultural arteries, keeping small, scattered bands connected in an era before cities. The reliability of these arteries depended on navigators, people whose memories served as living maps. In a world where misdirection could mean starvation or estrangement, those who could recall routes with clarity were invaluable. Navigation became a social responsibility, a form of expertise as essential as toolmaking or healing. There is something haunting in this shift. When goods began to move along remembered lines, geography itself became repeatable. The world was no longer just a space to survive in, but a network to traverse. Yet much of this knowledge has vanished. The paths themselves are invisible now, eroded by time, forests and fields. All that remains are the scattered traces of traded materials, silent markers of journeys once undertaken with intent. The challenge for us is to imagine not just the objects but the footsteps, the remembered bends and valleys, the stories told around fires to ensure that the path could be walked again. What these routes reveal is that navigation was never only about finding one's way in space. It was about weaving time, obligation, and memory together into a fabric that stretched across communities. Each exchange deepened that fabric until the land itself carried human meaning far beyond survival. The question that lingers is whether those early travellers, carrying shells, pigments, and stone, realised they were inventing something entirely new, not just paths but networks, threads of human connection that would eventually bind continents. When does a private memory become a collective map? For most of human history, navigation was stored in individual minds. A hunter recalled where the herd had crossed a valley last season, a gatherer remembered the location of fruiting trees, and elders carried the knowledge of rivers and ridges across decades of lived experience. But in the shift from the late Pleistocene to the early Holocene, something began to change. As climates stabilised and human groups grew more numerous and settled, knowledge could no longer remain only within one head. A memory had to be shared, reinforced, and preserved by groups if it was to remain useful. The act of navigation began its slow transformation into cartography, not in ink on parchment yet, but in communal structures of memory that functioned like maps. The reveal lies in how archaeological evidence suggests that communities were starting to invest in shared systems of orientation. By the end of the Ice Age, people were building permanent or semi-permanent settlements, some of which became hubs for repeated return. Sites like Göbekli Tepe in Anatolia or Lepenski Vir on the Danube were not just ritual or habitation centres, but focal points in a network of remembered landscapes. To return to them required more than an individual's recollection. Groups had to agree on shared markers, routes, and landmarks. In this sense, navigation became collective, a cultural act rather than a solitary one. Information about the transmission of these shared maps comes partly from how knowledge was materialised in objects. Engravings on stone and bone, discovered from the Upper Paleolithic into the Holocene, sometimes appear to represent rivers, mountains, or star patterns. Scholars debate whether these are maps in the modern sense, but there is little doubt that they carried spatial information. To carve a set of lines that others could recognise as a river valley or hunting ground is to externalise memory, to turn private knowledge into a shared reference. These may have been the earliest steps toward cartography. Not abstract charts, but memory anchors meant to be read by others in the group. Another layer of this transition was the increasing role of communal teaching. Foragers and early farmers alike relied on children being trained in the geography of their region. Elders took them on journeys, pointing out landmarks, explaining routes, and embedding collective spatial memory through repeated practice. This ensured that maps no longer lived only in an individual mind, but in a community of learners. Such teaching did not merely preserve knowledge, it standardized it, making sure that everyone understood a mountain or a river in the same way, creating a communal vocabulary of landscape. The implications of this shift are profound. Once memory became collective, navigation itself began to stabilize. A community could agree on where Snorth was, or where the big stone marked the turn toward water. This agreement allowed for coordinated action, trade and expansion. In a sense, the first shared maps were not lines on bark or clay, but consensus in the minds of many people. The earth itself was the page, and the collective memory of the group was the ink. Resolution comes when we understand that the birth of maps was less about invention than about cooperation. It was the recognition that a memory held by one person could vanish, but a memory shared among many could endure. The haunting question is how much of that early collective mapping has been lost to us. The carvings and stones that survive are only fragments of a much richer system of shared knowledge, systems that allowed people to cross landscapes we now consider impassable. What did those maps look like in full, when they were alive, not in museums but in memory? We cannot know, but we can glimpse their outlines in the traces left behind. One of the most revealing aspects of this shift from private memory to collective mapping lies in the way landscapes became layered with meaning. A boulder was not simply a boulder, it was a meeting place, a marker of direction, or the symbolic threshold of a territory. When groups began returning to the same landscapes again and again, these features took on roles that outlived the memory of any one traveller. A hill might come to be known as the Hill of the Spring, even if generations later no one remembered who first coined the phrase. In this way, names themselves became shared maps, embedding orientation into language. Archaeologists find evidence of this in the persistence of place names in traditional societies, many of which preserve references to features that may no longer even exist, like rivers that have long since dried up. We also see hints of shared maps in the clustering of ritual sites. During the early Holocene, ceremonial centres appeared at regular intervals across landscapes. This pattern suggests coordination, a sense of where each group's sphere of movement overlapped. To gather repeatedly at such places meant that people were not just memorising routes individually, but coordinating them collectively, ensuring that the path to the gathering was widely understood. Over time, these paths themselves may have become semi-formalised, not in physical roads, but in mental highways sustained by consensus. The land became gridded by social agreement. Art provides another clue. Rock carvings and cave paintings sometimes depict not only animals, but geometric shapes, grids, or clusters of dots. Some researchers interpret these as early attempts to record hunting territories or routes between camps. Even if such interpretations remain debated, the possibility itself shows how humans were stretching their imagination. How can we take something known in the mind and place it outside the body so that others may know it too? This step toward abstraction was essential. A shared map is, at its core, a collective abstraction of lived experience. The move toward agriculture added pressure to this process. Once fields were planted, herds managed, and harvests stored, people could not simply drift in response to weather or game. They needed to remember not only where resources were, but where boundaries lay, where irrigation channels ran, where neighbouring groups might lay claim. This sharpened the need for shared orientation systems. The fact that early farming villages were laid out with surprising regularity suggests that some form of collective spatial planning was already in place, an echo of the communal maps held in memory. It is striking that much of this knowledge was never written, yet it endured. The The shared mental map was resilient precisely because it was distributed across many minds. If one elder died, another could fill in the gap. If one generation forgot a landmark, another could remind them. In this way, geography was never wholly dependent on the frailty of an individual. It was safeguarded by the group. In a sense, these were the earliest forms of open source knowledge, information maintained not in private but in common. The haunting realization is that by the time the first physical maps were drawn, humanity already carried millennia of practice in creating shared maps of memory. Those drawn lines on clay or parchment were not sudden inventions, but the externalization of something people had long done together. The world was already mapped, just not in ways we can recover easily. What remains for us are faint echoes, a carved line on stone, a scatter of obsidian blades, a pattern of settlements. Each is a fragment of a collective landscape once alive in memory, now reduced to archaeology. And yet, the very fact that we can glimpse it suggests how powerfully humans have always sought to turn private knowing into communal orientation. Did we trade our internal compass for a glowing blue dot on a screen? For nearly all of human history, wayfinding meant relying on memory, instinct, and the environment. People could walk for days across forests, deserts, or tundra without written instructions because their brains had been trained since childhood to notice, recall, and share spatial detail. Today, in the age of GPS and satellite maps, many of us struggle to navigate even our own neighbourhoods without glancing at a phone. Something has shifted. The compass in our heads has not disappeared entirely, but it may have shrunk, underused and neglected in ways our ancestors could scarcely have imagined. The reveal lies in neuroscience. The hippocampus, the brain region central to spatial memory and navigation, is active when we build cognitive maps, internal representations of places and routes. Studies comparing traditional navigators, such as London taxi drivers who memorise thousands of street connections, to average modern citizens show differences in hippocampal structure and activity. The conclusion is stark. Practice shapes ability. When we no longer rely on our internal maps, the neural circuits that once supported them weaken. What was once essential to survival now lies dormant, crowded out by the convenience of external devices. Information from psychology reinforces this concern. Experiments reveal that people who habitually use GPS form weaker memories of routes compared to those who navigate by landmarks. Instead of building flexible internal maps, they tend to remember only the sequence of instructions: turn left, go straight, turn right, without grasping the larger structure of space. This reliance creates dependence. The blue dot is accurate but fragile, vanishing with a dead battery or a broken signal. Our ancestors carried redundancy in their minds. We outsource it to machines. This change is not simply about tools, but about experience. Foragers in the Amazon or the Kalahari can still recall dozens of plant species, water sources, and trails across immense regions. Arctic herders can track wind and snow with a precision honed by generations. Their spatial memory is not a luxury, but a living skill, one that modern urban life rarely demands. As a result, much of humanity drifts without cultivating the capacities that once defined us. The ability to notice subtle landmarks, to feel oriented by the sun's arc, or to recall paths across days and seasons. These capacities are fading in daily life, even though they remain wired into our brains. Resolution comes when we realize that something profound has been lost alongside the gain of convenience. We have inherited bodies and minds designed for navigation through complex dynamic landscapes, yet we live in worlds that flatten orientation into a screen with arrows. The haunting question is whether this trait is permanent. Have we abandoned forever the richness of internal navigation? Or can it be rekindled through practice, through walking without machines, through re-engagement with the land? The answer is uncertain. What we know is that the compass in our heads has not vanished. It waits, dormant, for us to remember how to use it. Another layer of this decline in our internal compass is cultural. For most of human history, navigation was not just a personal skill, but a shared practice woven into daily life. Children learned to orient themselves by shadow, slope, or vegetation, simply by following their elders. Journeys were not passive. everyone in a group paid attention because attention was survival. Today, by contrast, navigation has become a background task, often delegated to a device or a single driver, while others sit passively. When fewer people engage directly, fewer brains build the rich spatial memory networks that once defined us. Navigation has gone from a collective experience to an outsourced service, and with that shift, whole layers of awareness have thinned. Urban environments have added another twist. Streets laid out in grids, illuminated by signage and reinforced by digital overlays, reduce the cognitive demand of wayfinding. While this makes cities efficient, it also removes the very complexity that once sharpened human spatial sense. Compare this to the tangled paths of a rainforest, or the shifting dunes of a desert, where every step required recalibration. Our modern landscapes are designed for predictability, and in that predictability the brain relaxes. The hippocampus thrives on challenge, but when the world offers little navigational puzzle to solve, it idles. There is also evidence that the shrinking of our navigational habits has consequences beyond simply getting lost. Spatial memory is deeply linked to broader forms of memory and even imagination. When people exercise their internal mapping skills, they engage networks in the brain that support planning, storytelling, and the ability to picture scenarios not yet real. In other words, losing the habit of wayfinding may also dull our capacity to think flexibly about the future. The decline of navigation is not only about the loss of a compass, it may touch the very way we envision possibility. Yet we should be cautious not to frame this only as decline. Humans are adaptable, and the brain remains plastic. Studies have shown that people who deliberately re-engage with navigation, by exploring new places without GPS, by hiking with attention to terrain, or by training in orienteering, can regain skill and even increase hippocampal function. This suggests that the compass within us is not broken but neglected, waiting to be exercised again. The question is whether we will choose to make that effort in a world that rarely demands it. There is also an ethical dimension here. As navigation has shifted to technology, it has concentrated trust into invisible systems, satellites, algorithms, and corporate software. To depend entirely on these is to make ourselves vulnerable in ways our ancestors never were. A storm that blocks signals, a system failure, or a geopolitical disruption could leave millions disoriented. Our ancestors carried their maps in their heads and shared them through stories. We now carry them in fragile devices. Perhaps the haunting realization is that resilience lies not in abandoning tools, but in remembering how to balance them with older skills. So when we ask whether we have traded our internal compass for a glowing blue dot, the answer may be yes, but only temporarily. Beneath the layers of convenience, the ancient circuitry still exists. It flickers when we walk without guidance, when we notice the angle of the sun or the curve of a street, when we let ourselves be guided by memory rather than instruction. The map inside us is not gone. It waits for us to look up, to step outside, and to remember that navigation was never just about moving through space. It was about being fully present in the world. One way to see the change more clearly is to look at how travel itself feels different now compared to the past. For most of our species' history, movement was an act of discovery. Each bend in a river or ridge on the horizon held suspense, because it had to be remembered and placed into context. Even routine journeys contained micro-moments of attention. A landmark spotted, a shortcut considered, a path corrected. In contrast, much of modern travel has become passive. Whether by car, train or plane, the act of getting from one place to another often requires little more than following external instructions. We are transported rather than actively orienting ourselves. This passivity dulls not only skill, but also the relationship between movement and memory. A drive guided entirely by GPS may leave no imprint in our minds at all, while a walk guided by memory creates a lasting cognitive map. The shrinking of our internal compass also affects how we connect emotionally to place. Ancient navigation required intimacy with the environment, and that intimacy often led to attachment. A rock, a tree, or a stream might hold significance because it had guided people safely before. In modern contexts, we tend to interact with environments through abstract representations, icons on a screen, lists of directions, rather than through lived familiarity. This distances us from the land itself. We know where something is, but not what it feels like to move toward it. The result is a thinner sense of belonging, a detachment from geography that previous generations could not have imagined. There is also a generational element to this story. Children today are less likely to explore freely outdoors, less likely to memorize neighborhoods by wandering, and less likely to cultivate the mental habits of orientation. Instead, they are guided point by point, monitored by digital tools, and often discouraged from straying into the kind of uncertainty that once built spatial resilience. This is not a criticism, but a recognition of how cultural choices shape cognitive growth. If earlier generations carried the wilderness in their heads, many of us now carry only fragments of the city, and yet glimpses of the old capacities still surface. People often recall how vividly they remember the layout of a childhood home or a familiar forest trail even decades later. These deep imprints suggest that when given the chance, our brains still build strong cognitive maps. The haunting question, then, is not whether we are capable, but whether we allow ourselves the conditions to practice. The internal compass is not gone. It is simply buried under habits of convenience. The challenge is whether we will uncover it again, not because we need to in order to survive, but because it connects us more deeply to the world we move through. If ancient humans could cross continents without maps, what excuse do we have for feeling lost today? It is an unsettling question, because it forces us to measure ourselves not against machines, but against the memory of our own species. For tens of thousands of years, people moved through a world without roads, without compasses, without satellites. They crossed mountains and deserts, rivers and oceans, carrying in their minds the only maps that existed. They did not have the privilege of convenience, but they had the resilience of attention, the intimacy of living with land. To them, disorientation was not a passing frustration. It could mean death. And yet they endured, not by luck, but by cultivating a skill that defined their relationship with the earth. The reveal is that navigation was never just about movement. It was about identity. To know where you were was to know who you were, what group you belonged to, which territories you could traverse, which stories and memories tied you to the land. Orientation anchored not only bodies but minds. The line between geography and memory was blurred, because the land itself carried the history of people and the continuity of culture. Losing direction did not simply mean being physically adrift. It meant severing connection with meaning. As we reflect, it becomes clear that lostness today feels different. We rarely die from taking the wrong turn. Instead, we experience a subtler, more existential disorientation. Surrounded by digital maps and constant signals, we still sometimes feel that we do not know where we are. The old skills that once gave us confidence in our place have weakened, and with them a sense of belonging. We may know our coordinates, but that is not the same as knowing the ground beneath our feet, or the history it holds, or the patterns that link us to it. Perhaps this is why the metaphor of being lost remains so powerful. It points not to geography, but to identity, to the fear that we no longer inhabit the world in the same rooted way. The information we have suggests that orientation is a universal human drive. Even infants respond to spatial cues. Even in dreams we construct landscapes. The desire to know where we are is woven into our minds as deeply as the desire to eat or sleep. To forget how to orient is to forget something about ourselves. When we look back at the long arc of human history, we see not just migrations and maps, but a record of constant striving to connect body, memory, and place. Every journey was both a path through the land and a rehearsal of what it meant to be human. The resolution may not be comforting, but it is clarifying. We are still capable of finding our way, not just across landscapes, but back into awareness of them. The haunting question is whether we choose to practice that capacity, or whether we allow it to fade into disuse. If those who came before us could cross continents guided only by memory, what excuse do we have for failing to look up from our screens, to notice the sky, the slope, the smell of the air, and to know again where we are? There is also the question of what it means to be found. For our ancestors, being found was rarely about a fixed point on a map. It was about being inside a web of relationships. You were found when you could name the river bend where fish spawned, when you could recall the ridgeline that led to shelter, when you knew which tree marked the boundary of another group's range. To be located was to be connected. Today, when we say we are found, it usually means that a device has placed us at a set of coordinates. Yet those numbers tell us little about meaning. They cannot explain why a place matters, who walked there before us, or how it fits into a story larger than ourselves. Perhaps this is why we can feel both digitally located and existentially lost at the same time. We might also ask whether the very idea of progress has hidden a quiet erosion. Technology tells us we can move faster, with less effort and less risk of error. And it is true. No one longs for the dangers of starvation on a miscalculated desert crossing, or the terror of wandering in a blizzard. Yet what has been gained in ease may have been matched by what has been lost in intimacy. To earn a landscape through attention, to recognise the subtle change of light that marks east, or the way a valley funnels wind, is to belong to it in a way that technology cannot replace. The cost of constant efficiency may be estrangement from the very earth we move across. Another dimension of being lost is time itself. Ancient people were not only navigating space but synchronizing with seasons. The right migration had to coincide with the thaw of rivers, the return of herds, the ripening of plants. To lose track of time was to lose track of life's rhythms. Today, our clocks and calendars provide precision down to the second, but they sever us from the cyclical awareness that once anchored existence. We may know the date, but do we know when the first birds migrate, when the moon will be full, or when the soil warms enough to awaken seeds? Being found in time was once inseparable from being found in space. Now we hold one but let the other slip away. And yet, not all is gone. People still feel flashes of the old compass when they step into wilderness, when they leave the highway and wander a forest trail, or when they notice how the sunset stretches shadows across familiar streets. These moments remind us that the skills of orientation are not fully extinct. They wait in us, latent, ready to be reawakened. Perhaps the final question is not only whether we know where we are, but whether we are willing to relearn how to listen. The answer cannot be given by satellites or screens. It rests in the ancient habit of attention, the willingness to notice, to remember, and to let the world itself guide us home. To reflect on whether we still know where we are, it helps to notice how we speak about direction in everyday language. We say we are centred when calm, adrift when uncertain, grounded when confident. These are not accidental metaphors. They echo the way orientation has always been tied to human emotion. For ancient travellers, being lost was not a poetic idea but a physical threat. For us, the feeling lingers as metaphor because the body remembers. Even without the danger of predators or starvation, disorientation unsettles us deeply, as if tapping into an older layer of fear. To know where you are is still to feel safe, still to feel whole. Perhaps this is why so many spiritual traditions, across cultures, frame wisdom as a form of navigation. Pilgrimage, wandering, exile, and homecoming all rely on the language of movement through space. To be enlightened is often described as finding the way. These echoes suggest that navigation is not just practical but existential. It structures how we imagine our place in the cosmos. Losing that deeper sense of direction may explain why modern life, for all its tools, often feels unmoored. There is also the irony that we are more mapped than ever before. Satellites chart every corner of the planet, our phones record each step, and yet this flood of precision does not always translate into meaning. We know the world's coordinates, but not necessarily its contours of belonging. In some ways, the more externalized our maps become, the less we seem to hold within ourselves. It is as though we have outsourced not only memory but orientation, leaving us with information but not connection. And so the question persists. Do we still know where we are? The answer may depend on how we define knowing. If it means recognizing our exact coordinates on a screen, then yes, we are more precise than ever. But if it means feeling embedded in the rhythms of place, if it means reading the land as a story and ourselves as characters within it, then perhaps we are less certain than those who came before us. The haunting possibility is that in gaining the world as a map, we may have lost the world as a home. Thank you, fellow sapiens, for wandering this timeline with me, for drifting into deep time, for slowing down and remembering. If this helped you fall asleep, helped you study, or simply helped you step out of the noise for a while, thank you for being here. If you think more people should know this story, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, share it with the sapiens in your life, and tell me, are you listening before bed, while working, or somewhere in the world I can only imagine? And as always, stay curious, stay calm. I'll see you in the next story.